Eleanor's hands were dry. The skin around her cuticles was splitting from the cheap lemon-scented dish soap she bought in bulk. She stood at the laminate kitchen counter, where the pattern of fake granite had worn down to a dull gray smudge near the sink. She was sorting her father's evening medications. Yellow tablet, 100 milligrams. White oblong caplet, 500 milligrams. A small, pink capsule that always smelled faintly of vinegar when the bottle was opened. Each one made a small, distinct tink sound as it dropped into the plastic compartment marked 2 pem. In the next room, the floorboards groaned. It was a rhythmic, predictable sound. 3 boards near the television cabinet that Arthur always stepped on when he paced. He was waiting for the evening news to start. From the dining room, Martha's voice rose. It had that airy, breathless quality Eleanor hadn't heard directed at her since she was 7 years old. "Oh, Julian, truly. The boat tour is included in the package, but is it the one with the glass bottom or the private one? You must do the private one. You work so hard, darling. You deserve to see the Amalfi Coast properly." Eleanor didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the pill organizer. The plastic latch of the Wed-Am compartment was broken. It didn't snap shut anymore. She had been using a small piece of blue painter's tape to hold it down for 3 months. She peeled the tape back, her thumb feeling the sticky, lint-covered residue on the edge of the blue strip. The bank alert on her phone screen was still lit, sitting just to the right of the bread box. Account ending in 3104. Withdrawal of $8,450. Balance 112 fort. She had checked it 40 minutes ago while sitting in her car in the driveway. The engine idling, the heater blowing stale, metallic-smelling air into her face. She hadn't cried. She had just stared at the digital numbers until the headlights of a passing car swept across her dashboard, illuminating the thin layer of dust on the steering column. Now she took the blue painter's tape and pressed it back down over the Wednesday compartment. She pressed it hard enough that the tip of her thumb turned white. "Arthur, did you hear?" Martha called out, her slippers scuffing against the faded Persian rug in the hallway. Julian's hotel has a private balcony overlooking the water. He sent a photo. "It's just the blue of that sea, Arthur. It doesn't look real." Arthur didn't answer immediately. The television volume increased by 2 notches. A local car commercial jingle filled the silence. "He should take the helicopter transfer from Naples." Arthur's voice grunted from the recliner. "The roads down there are a mess this time of year. Too many tour buses." "Oh," he said he might, Martha said, entering the kitchen. She was still holding the phone, though she had pressed the mute button with her thumb. Her eyes swept past Eleanor, landing on the kettle. "Is there any of that chamomile left, Eleanor? My throat is a bit dry." Eleanor didn't look up from the pills. She had 1 pink capsule left in her palm. It was light, almost weightless. "We're out of chamomile, I told you on Friday." Martha sighed, a soft, fluttering sound of mild disappointment, as if Eleanor had personally cleared the shelves of the grocery store. "Oh, I must have forgotten. Well, you can get some tomorrow when you go after work." She released the mute button. "Julian?" "Yes, sweetie, I'm still here." Your father says you should take the helicopter. Yes, we'll make sure you have enough for the deposits. Don't worry about the currency conversion fees. We've taken care of it. Martha walked back toward the living room. Her shoulder-length gray hair, catching the harsh light of the fluorescent tube overhead. Eleanor watched a small bead of water drip from the kitchen faucet. It hung there, swelling, before dropping into the stainless steel sink with a sharp metallic plink. The water in the basin was lukewarm now. A thin film of grease from the pork chops they had eaten for dinner had settled over the surface, iridescent under the light. Eleanor reached her hand into the water. The cold grease clung to her skin. She found the sponge at the bottom of the sink, squeezed it, and began to wipe down the stove. The stove was an old gas model, the white enamel stained yellow around the burners from decades of boiled over. Starch and spat oil. Eleanor scrubbed the circle of the back right burner. She did it with a steady rhythmic pressure. She was calculating. Her car needed a new alternator. The mechanic at the shop down the road had quoted her $420, assuming she didn't mind a refurbished part. Her emergency savings, the $8,450, had been her margin. It was the physical distance between her and this house. It was the tank of gas, the deposit on a studio apartment in the city 3 hours north, the 6 months of groceries she would need while she looked for a job that didn't involve checking someone else's blood pressure at 6 in the morning. Now she had $112.14. The transfer had been made from the joint savings account. When she was 18, her father had insisted on being a co-signer so she could build credit at the local credit union. She had never thought to change it. It was just a number on a screen, a quiet security deposit. She added $50 to every Tuesday after she got. Paid from the clinic. They hadn't asked. They hadn't even left a note. Eleanor, Arthur called from the living room. Did you put the trash out? It's Tuesday. Not yet, Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the irritation they usually use to trigger an argument. An argument would require energy. It would require Martha to look up from her phone and say, "Why are you always so defensive?" And Arthur to sigh and mutter about how hard he worked to keep a roof over their heads. "Well, do it before the trucks come," Arthur said. "The wind is picking up. I don't want the lid blowing into the miller's yard again." Eleanor rinsed the sponge. The water ran gray down the drain. She walked to the back door, her shoes squeaking slightly on the worn linoleum, where the pattern had completely rubbed away to reveal the yellow adhesive underneath. The air outside was cold. It smelled of damp earth and the neighbor's wood stove. The green plastic trash bin sat by the side of the garage, under the shadow of the overgrown lilac bush. Eleanor dragged it down the gravel driveway. The wheels rattle-clattered against the stones. Clack, 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 clack. On the kitchen wall inside, behind the yellowed curtains, she could see the silhouette of her mother. Martha was gesturing with one hand, still talking to Julian. Julian was 34. He lived in a high-rise in Chicago. He hadn't visited the house since Thanksgiving 2 years ago, when he stayed for 3 hours, complained about the damp smell in the guest room, and left early because of an urgent client dinner. He had left a pile of dirty laundry on the floor for Eleanor to wash. Eleanor stood by the curb, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. She looked down into the open trash bin. Inside, on top of the black plastic bags, lay the mail from this afternoon, an envelope from the credit union addressed to her. It had already been opened. The paper flap was torn jaggedly, as if someone had used a dull butter knife in a hurry. Inside was the paper statement she had forgotten to paperless cancel. She didn't pick it up. She just looked at the torn white paper resting against the black plastic. She stood there for 3 minutes, watching the wind lift the corner of the envelope, exposing her name, Eleanor Vance. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, closing the side door softly behind her, making sure the latch didn't click. The kitchen was always coldest at 5:45 in the morning. Eleanor stood in her socks on the worn linoleum, waiting for the blue flame of the gas burner to catch. It took 3 clicks of the dial, tick, 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 before the ring of fire bloomed with a soft, hollow whoosh. The heat was immediate but narrow, barely warming her knuckles as she held her hands over the grate. The kitchen smelled of damp dishcloths and the faint, sweet trace of the generic liquid floor wax she had applied 3 weeks ago. Through the small window above the sink, the backyard was a study in gray and charcoal. A heavy frost had silvered the tops of the overgrown lilac bushes, and the rusted frame of the old swing set Julian had outgrown 20 years ago. Eleanor reached into the pantry and pulled out a blue cardboard box of generic bran flakes. Normally, Wednesday mornings followed a strict, unwritten choreography. Arthur's knees would click at the top of the stairs at precisely 6 o'clock. By the time his slippered feet hit the kitchen floor, Eleanor would have 2 eggs, soft scrambled in real butter, not the margarine, and 2 slices of wheat toast, buttered to the edges while still hot, so the yellow pool sank deep into the crumb. Today, she set the blue cardboard box in the center of the table. Beside it, she placed 2 white ceramic bowls. The ceramic was chipped at the rims, exposing the dark gray clay beneath the glaze. They were part of a set Martha had received as a wedding present. The pristine ones, the ones with the delicate green ivy pattern that had never been put in the dishwasher, were locked away in the china cabinet in the dining room, reserved for when Julian came home. Arthur's footsteps sounded on the stairs. It was a slow, heavy descent, the wood groaning under his weight. He entered the kitchen, his flannel robe tied loosely around his thick waist. He didn't look at Eleanor. He went straight to the small thermostat on the wall near the refrigerator, his thumb automatically pushing the plastic lever up. "Don't touch that," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet, but it had a flat, level weight that made Arthur pause. His hand remained hovered over the plastic box. "It's freezing in here, Eleanor," he muttered, his voice thick with morning phlegm. "The draft from the back door is coming right through the hallway. The gas bill was 40% higher last month," Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on the blue flame beneath the kettle. "We agreed to keep it at 62 until April." "We didn't agree," Arthur said. though he slowly let his hand fall to his side. He shuffled to his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. He sat down, his joints cracking in the quiet room. He looked at the table. He looked at the box of bran flakes. He looked at the empty bowls. He waited. The silence stretched between them, marked only by the rising hiss of the kettle. Usually by this point, Eleanor would have already served him his tea and asked how his back felt. She would have reminded him to take his yellow pill before he ate, not after, because the doctor said the absorption was better on an empty stomach. Today she stood by the stove, her back to him, watching the steam begin to curl from the copper spout. "Where's the butter?" Arthur asked. His voice wasn't angry. It was merely confused, the tone of a man who had walked into his own bathroom and found the sink on the opposite wall. "In the fridge," Eleanor said. Arthur's eyebrows pulled together. He looked at her back, then at the empty table. "Are we out of eggs?" "No." "Well, are you going to make them? Or—" "I'm not hungry," Eleanor said. She took the kettle off the burner. The blue flame died with a tiny, clean snap. She poured the hot water into a single mug, her own. She had chosen a plain gray mug with a hairline cracked down the handle. She walked to the table, sat down across from him, and placed her mug on a cork coaster. She did not bring the milk carton from the refrigerator. She did not bring the butter dish. She did not bring the orange juice that she usually squeezed by hand, because the store-bought cartons made Arthur's reflux flare. Arthur stared at her. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He reached out and pulled the blue box of bran flakes toward him. His movements were awkward, his large, stiff fingers fumbling with the cardboard tab. He tore the top flap jaggedly. "Your mother's neck is giving her trouble again," he said, his eyes on the cereal box as he tipped it over his bowl. The dry, brown flakes spilled out with a paper-dry rustle. She didn't sleep well. She was up until 3, talking to Julian. He's trying to decide between the 5-star place in Sorrento or the boutique villa further up the hill. It's a lot of decisions for him. He's under a tremendous amount of stress at the firm. Eleanor took a sip of her tea. It was plain black tea, no sugar, no milk. The bitter taste coated her tongue, hot and sharp. "He should take the boutique villa," Eleanor said. Arthur looked up, surprised by her agreement. A small, relieved smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Yes? You think so?" "That's what your mother told him. It's more private. He doesn't want to be surrounded by tourists." "It's more expensive," Eleanor said, her voice remaining perfectly level. $300 more a night, according to the website. But he should definitely do it. Arthur's smile faltered. His eyes drifted to the kitchen counter, where the opened envelope from the credit union lay face down next to the toaster. He cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound. He poured some dry flakes into his bowl, then looked toward the refrigerator. "Is there milk?" he asked. "Yes." He waited for 3 seconds, his hand resting on the edge of the table. When Eleanor didn't move, he slowly pushed himself up from the chair. His knees made a sharp pop as he stood. He walked to the refrigerator, his slippers dragging on the linoleum, and opened the door. The light from inside the fridge cast a pale, cold glow over his face. He reached for the milk carton, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second over the jar of imported preserves Martha had bought for Julian's last visit. The one that had sat in the back of the shelf untouched for 14 months. Did you get the chamomile? Arthur asked, his back still turned to her. No, Eleanor said. Martha said she asked you yesterday. I didn't have time, Eleanor said. She was looking at her fingernails. There was a tiny speck of dry white plaster under her left index nail from where she had patched the wall in the hallway last week. After Arthur had scraped it with his walker, she began to clean it out with the tip of a toothpick. Well, she's going to need it today, Arthur said, his tone rising slightly, a small edge of irritation creeping into his voice. He brought the milk to the table and poured it over his cereal. She's got that cough again. You know how she gets when the weather changes. You should probably run down to the pharmacy before your shift. Eleanor didn't answer. She was doing the math in her head. The pharmacy was 3 miles in the opposite direction of the clinic. 6 miles round trip at $3.89 a gallon, with her car's failing alternator drawing extra battery power every time she turned the key. Those 6 miles would cost her approximately $1.40 in gas, plus the 18 minutes of idle time at the 3 traffic lights on Main Street. Her total liquid net worth was $112.14. If she drove straight to the clinic and straight back, she could make the 3 gallons left in her tank last until Friday afternoon, when her bi-weekly direct deposit cleared. If she drove to the pharmacy, she would have to put $5 of gas in the tank today. To do that, she would have to use her debit card, which would leave her with $107. I won't be able to go to the pharmacy, Eleanor said. Arthur stopped his spoon halfway to his mouth. A drop of milk fell back into the bowl with a tiny splat. He stared at her, his forehead furrowing. Why not? I don't have the gas, Eleanor said. Well, just use the card, Arthur said, his voice carrying the casual, dismissive tone of someone who had never had to count the pennies in a coin purse. The joint one, or your own. It's just $8 for the tea. Eleanor, it's not a major expense. He didn't mention the $8,450. He didn't mention that the joint one had been drained to a balance of $12.50 to cover the wire transfer to Julian's travel. Agent. He looked at her with a mild, patronizing confusion, as if she were being deliberately difficult about a grocery run. I don't have the money, Eleanor said. She set her mug down. The ceramic clicked against the cork coaster. Martha's voice drifted down from the upstairs hallway, high and thin. Arthur, is Eleanor down there? Tell her to bring up my heating pad when she comes. My shoulder is stiff as a board. Arthur looked at Eleanor, waiting for her to get up and go to the linen closet in the hallway where the heating pad was kept. Eleanor picked up her mug, took another slow sip of her bitter tea, and looked out the window at the frost-covered lilac bushes. She didn't move a muscle. The smell of menthol rub preceded Martha down the stairs. It was a sharp, clinical odor that always clung to the hallway walls on damp mornings, masking the deeper scent of old wool and the slow rot of the wooden floorboards beneath the radiator. Martha entered the kitchen, one hand pressed firmly against the curve of her left collarbone. Her face was pinched into a familiar pattern of pale, soft martyrdom. She looked at the table, her eyes scanning the blue cardboard cereal box, the empty white bowl in front of Arthur, and the single gray mug in Eleanor's hand. "Arthur," Martha said, her voice dropping into a dry whisper, "where is the heating pad? I've been waiting." "I told you," Arthur said, his mouth half full of dry bran flakes. "Eleanor's not going up. She says she's not hungry." Martha turned her gaze to Eleanor. It was a slow, heavy look, the kind she used when she wanted to remind Eleanor of her place, without actually having to speak. It was the look of a manager observing an employee who had missed a shift. "The heating pad is in the linen closet, Eleanor," Martha said, her tone dropping into a gentle instructional register, as if she were speaking to a slightly slow child. "Under the yellow towels. You know my shoulder gets like this when the humidity jumps." Eleanor took her mug to the sink. She turned on the tap. The pipes in the basement wall knocked 3 times. A hollow metallic clunk, clunk, clunk. Before the water began to trickle, she rinsed the mug under the cold stream. She didn't use soap. She didn't wash the spoon Arthur had left on the laminate. She simply placed her single gray mug upside down in the rubber drying rack. "I'm leaving for work in 10 minutes, Eleanor said. Martha's hand slid down from her shoulder. Her expression shifted from soft pain to a subtle defensive stiffness. "Well, surely it only takes 30 seconds to open the closet, Eleanor. I can barely lift my arm to get my robe on. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for a little help before you walk out the door." She waited. In the quiet, the refrigerator compressor kicked on with a loud, vibrating shudder that made the small glass jar of toothpicks on the windowsill rattle. "The linen closet is 5 feet from your bedroom door, Mom," Eleanor said. She didn't turn around to look at her mother. She kept her eyes on the small drain in the bottom of the sink, where a single wet tea leaf was stuck to the stainless steel grid. Martha let out a small, dry laugh, a sound that was meant to be polite but carried a sharp, thin edge. "I see well. I suppose if it's too much trouble for you, I'll just have to manage. If I tear something in my rotator cuff again, we'll just have to hope the clinic has an opening." She walked to the table, her slippers whispering against the linoleum. She reached for the milk carton, her knuckles red and swollen from her arthritis. She poured a thin stream into Arthur's bowl, then looked at the blue box. "Did you get the chamomile?" she asked. "No," Eleanor said. "Arthur said you didn't have the gas," Martha said. She sat down in the chair next to Arthur's, her movements stiff and deliberate. She didn't look at Eleanor. Instead, she looked at the corner of her tablet, which was resting on the table. "I must say, Eleanor, I don't understand how you're always so short. You don't have rent. You don't have a mortgage. We only ask for $200 a month for the utilities, and half the time we let that slide when your car acts up." She tapped the screen of her tablet. The blue light reflected in her glasses. "Julian says the bank transfer went through last night," Martha said, her voice instantly losing its dry, strained quality, warming into a soft, melodic hum. He was so relieved. He said the villa was almost fully booked for the season. He's going to send us postcards from Positano. He wants to frame one for the living room. Arthur nodded, his chin covered in a thin smear of milk. He should. A nice large one. Maybe over the mantel, where the old clock used to be. He said he might even be able to hire a local guide for the ruins at Pompeii. Martha continued, her thumb scrolling through her email. He's always wanted to see the plaster casts. He's so intellectual, that boy. He gets that from my father's side. Eleanor walked out of the kitchen. She didn't make a sound as she crossed the faded carpet of the dining room. The room was dark, the heavy velvet drapes drawn tight to keep the draft out. On the sideboard sat the long row of Julian's trophies. There were 12 of them. The largest was a gold-plated cup from his high school debate championship in 2008. The gold leaf was peeling at the base, exposing the dull gray plastic beneath. A thin layer of gray dust had settled in the hollows of the plastic figures. Eleanor had dusted those trophies every Saturday morning for 12 years. It was part of her chores, the ones she had continued to do long after Julian had packed his leather suitcases and moved to the city. She stood in the narrow hallway by the front door, looking at her reflection in the small oval mirror that hung above the telephone table. Her face looked gray in the half-light. Her eyes were dark, shadowed by a sleeplessness that had nothing to do with Julian's travel itinerary. She picked up her hairbrush from the table. It was a cheap plastic thing with half its bristles missing. She began to brush her hair, her movements slow and rhythmic. 1, 2, 3. Behind her reflection in the glass, she could see the reflection of the trophies on the sideboard. She calculated. The alternator was drawing 12.2 volts. The battery was 5 years old. If she turned on the headlights, the heater fan, and the rear defroster at the same time, the voltage would drop below 11.8 within 6 miles. At 11.8, the fuel injection system would begin to misfire. She would have to drive in the dark without the heater. She would have to keep the fan off, letting the cold air from the vents clear the frost from the inside of the windshield. It was 28 degrees outside. Eleanor. Martha called from the kitchen. Her voice was louder now, carrying that familiar, sharp demand wrapped in polite concern. If you're going to the clinic, you need to take the garbage bag from the bathroom with you. The bin is full. Eleanor didn't answer. She put the hairbrush down. She reached for her winter coat, a heavy, unwashed wool coat she had bought at a thrift store 3 winters ago. It smelled of old cedar and wet wool. She slipped her arms into the sleeves, her fingers cold against the lining. She grabbed her purse from the small wooden table. Inside, the leather was worn thin at the corners. She opened the zipper. Her fingers found the small plastic debit card, $112. She closed her purse. Eleanor? Martha called again, her slippers scuffing toward the kitchen door. Did you hear me? The bathroom bin? Eleanor opened the front door. The cold morning air hit her face like a wet towel. The frost on the wooden steps was thick, white, and glittering under the pale light of the single street lamp at the corner of the road. She stepped out onto the porch. pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind her. She didn't slam it. She just pulled it until the brass latch clicked into the frame. A small, clean sound that was instantly swallowed by the wind in the bare branches of the oak tree in the front yard. The interior of the 1998 Toyota Corolla smelled of cold, cracked vinyl and the faint, sour ghost of a coffee. Eleanor's had spilled on the passenger side floor mat 6 months ago. The air was colder inside the car than it was outside. A delicate, fern-like pattern of frost covered the inside of the windshield, obscuring the street. Eleanor sat for a moment, her hands in her lap. The wool of her coat felt stiff and abrasive against her skin. She didn't put the key in the ignition yet. She knew the battery was weak, especially in the cold. It would take 1, maybe 2 attempts to turn the engine over. 3 would drain it completely. She leaned forward, her breath a white plume in the frigid air, and wiped a small circle on the windshield with the sleeve of her coat. Through the smeared opening, she could see the front of the house. The kitchen light was a pale yellow square against the pre-dawn gray. No one was at the window. She inserted the key. She turned it to the on position, but not to start. The dashboard lights flickered weakly. The small red battery icon remained lit. The fuel gauge needle trembled just above the empty line. 3 gallons, maybe 2.5. She waited. She counted to 10, a habit she'd developed over the winter, letting the battery gather what little charge it had. Then she turned the key. The starter motor made a slow, grinding groan. Rrrr. It was a thick, exhausted sound, like a man trying to stand up with a heavy weight on his back. The engine coughed once, a shudder running through the car's frame, and then fell silent. Eleanor closed her eyes. She did not feel panic. She felt a familiar, dull resignation. She was calculating the variables. Option 1, walk back inside. Ask Arthur for a jump start from his truck. This would require explaining why she had left without saying goodbye. It would involve Martha's soft, disappointed sighs and questions about her mood. It would end with her fetching the heating pad and taking out the bathroom trash before being allowed to leave, late for her shift. Option 2, try again. She turned the key back to the off position. She counted to 20 this time, the numbers a silent, steady rhythm in her head. She pictured the acid moving between the lead plates inside the battery, a slow chemical reaction that felt as tired as she did. On 20, she turned the key again. Chug. The engine caught. It sputtered violently for a few seconds, the whole car shaking, before settling into a rough, uneven idle. The check engine light glowed a steady, mocking orange on the dashboard. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It clouded the small patch she had wiped on the windshield. She turned the defrost fan on, but only to the lowest setting. The air that came out of the vents was as cold as the air in the car, but at least it was moving. It smelled metallic, like hot dust on old wires. She put the car in reverse and backed slowly out of the driveway. The tires crunched over the thin layer of frozen gravel. She didn't look back at the house. She focused on the side mirror, watching the neighbor's picket fence slide by. The drive to the clinic was 6 miles. It took her through the quiet, Sleeping streets of the town's oldest residential neighborhood. The houses were small, with neat, square lawns and dark windows. The only lights were the blue-white glare of the occasional porch lamp. Her purse was on the passenger seat. At the third stop sign, her phone, inside the purse, began to vibrate against the worn fabric. The sound was a low, insistent buzz, loud in the relative silence of the rattling car. It was a text message. She didn't have to look to know who it was from. She kept her eyes on the road. The turn signal clicked with a slow, rhythmic tick like an old clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock. At the next light, she glanced at the phone screen. It was lit, displaying a message preview from her mother. Your father's blood pressure was high this morning. 148/95. You know he's not supposed to have so much salt. Did you use the low-sodium broth in the gravy last night? Eleanor's hands tightened on the freezing plastic of the steering wheel. Her knuckles were white. The gravy had been from a packet, the same kind she had been using for 5 years. Arthur had insisted on it, saying he liked the rich, beefy flavor. She had bought the low-sodium version once. He had pushed his plate away and said it tasted like brown water. The light turned green. A car behind her honked, a short, impatient blast. Eleanor pressed the accelerator gently, careful not to rev the struggling engine. She was doing the math again. A text back would take 30 seconds. It was the same gravy as always, but that text would not be the end. It would be the beginning. It would be followed by another. Well, we need to be more careful. His health is fragile, Eleanor. You know that. We need to find a new recipe. The conversation would spiral, pulling her focus, draining the small reservoir of energy she needed just to get through her 8-hour shift of changing wound dressings and recording patient vitals. Silence was a form of energy conservation. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Her father's name appeared on the screen, accompanied by the grainy photo she had taken of him 3 years ago at the town fair, holding a half-eaten corn dog. He was squinting in the sun. The phone vibrated on the seat next to her, a frantic, demanding dance. The sound filled the small, cold car. Eleanor let it ring. It rang 7 times, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. She turned into the parking lot of the Briarwood Medical Clinic. It was a low brick building with a flat roof. A few other cars were already parked, their tailpipes puffing white clouds into the gray morning air. She pulled into her usual spot at the far end of the lot, under a large oak tree whose bare branches looked like black veins against the sky. She turned off the ignition. The engine died with a final rattling sigh. Her phone buzzed one more time. A new text from her mother. Where are you? Your father is calling, and you're not picking up. Please have the decency to let us know you are safe. Eleanor stared at the words, decency. The word seemed to hang in the air. She picked up the phone. Her thumb was numb with cold. She pressed the power button on the side of the device. A menu appeared on the screen. Restart or power off. Her thumb moved with slow, deliberate pressure to the second option. The screen went black. She put the phone back in her purse, zipped it shut, and opened the car door. The cold air rushed in, smelling of pine needles and asphalt. She got out of the car, locked the door, and walked toward the clinic entrance, her keys jingling softly in her pocket, the only sound she was making. The air in the clean utility room of the Briarwood Medical Clinic was dry, sterile, and smelled faintly of lavender-scented sanitizer and bleached cotton. A large industrial air purifier hummed in the corner, a steady, low-frequency vibration that Eleanor felt more in her teeth than her ears. She stood before the metal shelving unit, executing her midday inventory routine. With her left hand, she pulled a box of 3-inch sterile roller bandages from the top shelf. With her right, she checked the stamped black ink on the side. Lot 40922, EXP112227. She placed it in the plastic bin labeled surgical prep, then reached for the next. Crinkle, slide, stack. The rhythm was mechanical, mindless, and completely necessary. It kept her hands occupied while her brain worked through the cold arithmetic of her life. She was 32. At her wage of $18.50 an hour, after taxes, her take-home pay was $2,340 a month. $200 of that went straight to her parents for utilities, though she paid for her own groceries, her own gas, her own car insurance, and her own phone bill. She had calculated the exact cost of her exit 3 months ago. A small, one-way moving truck from this town in Ohio to Portland, Oregon, where her college roommate had a spare room in a townhouse. $1,600. First month's rent and a security deposit. $2,400. A reserve of $4,000 to keep her afloat for 3 months, while she transferred her medical assistant license to the new state and looked for a clinic job. Total $8,000. She had reached $8,450 last Tuesday. She had planned to tell her clinic manager on the 15th of the month that she was giving her 2 weeks' notice. She had already drafted the letter on her computer, saving it under a generic file name, Standard Protocol 2026, Docs. So her mother wouldn't see it if she snooped through her laptop. Now she had $112.14. If she saved $50 a week, the maximum she could manage with the rising cost of groceries and the inevitable $400 repair bill for her car's alternator, it would take her exactly 166 weeks to rebuild that fund. 3 years, 3 years of Tuesdays. 3 years of checking Arthur's blood pressure, of scrubbing the yellowed enamel of the stove, of listening to Julian's voice coming through the phone like a transmission from a different sunlit universe. She looked at her hands. They were white, dry, and powdered with a thin layer of starch from the latex-free gloves she had discarded 10 minutes ago. She picked up a box of saline flushes, EXP092028. Her timeline had been deleted. They had taken her time. A light tap on the doorframe broke the hum of the air purifier. Eleanor didn't jump. She carefully placed the saline flushes on the second shelf before turning around. Sarah, the clinic's receptionist, was leaning against the jamb, a black plastic clipboard tucked under her arm. Sarah was 24, with bright eyes and a high ponytail that bounced when she talked. She was still young enough to find the clinic's daily drama exciting. "Hey," Sarah said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "Your mom just called the front desk." Eleanor felt a tiny cold knot tighten in her stomach. She kept her face expressionless. What did she want? She said your cell phone was going straight to voicemail, and she was worried you'd been in a ditch because of the black ice on Route 4, Sarah said. She smiled, a soft, sympathetic expression. She was super sweet. She apologized like 3 times for calling the work line. She said she just gets so nervous about you driving that old car in the winter. The battery was dead, Eleanor said. Yeah, that's what I figured, Sarah said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. She told me to tell you that your dad found his heating pad, so you don't need to worry about that. But she wanted to make sure you stopped by the market on the way home to get the special broth. She said you'd know what she meant. She was like, "Oh, Eleanor always takes such good care of us. I don't know what we'd do without her." Sarah sighed, a small sound of genuine envy. My mom doesn't even call me on my birthday unless I text her first. You're so lucky, Elle. Your family is so close. Yes, Eleanor said, we are. Anyway, she said to tell you to turn your phone back on when you get a second, just so she knows you made it to your shift okay. She sounded really anxious. I will, Eleanor said. Cool, doctor. Evans is ready for the dressing change in room 3 when you're done with the inventory. Sarah gave a quick, cheerful wave and disappeared down the hall, her soft-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum. Eleanor remained standing in front of the metal shelves. The room was silent again, save for the hum of the air purifier. Martha hadn't called because she was worried about the black ice. Martha knew Eleanor had been driving that route for 6 years, in every kind of weather. She had called to put a leash on her. By calling the clinic's main line, she had accomplished 3 things. She had verified that Eleanor was indeed at work and not sitting in a coffee shop or a lawyer's office. She had forced Eleanor to receive a message by proxy, making her dead phone irrelevant. And she had established herself to Eleanor's coworkers as a loving, concerned mother, making any future complaints Eleanor might make about her look like the ungrateful griping of a difficult daughter. It was a perfect, bloodless maneuver. It was how Martha had managed the household for 40 years. No shouting, no physical locks on the doors. Just a web of soft, sticky obligations, spun so thin you didn't realize you were wrapped in them until you tried to take a step. Eleanor reached into her pocket. She pulled out her phone. It was still cold from the car. She pressed the power button. The screen flickered, then illuminated with the brand logo. Within 10 seconds of the signal bars appearing, the notifications began to cascade down the screen. Missed call. Home 3. Missed call. Arthur Vance 2. Text Martha Vance 7:42 a.m. Eleanor, please call. Text Martha Vance 8:15 a.m. Your father's leg is swelling again. We need you to check it when you get home. Text Julian Vance 9:30 a.m. Hey Elle, Mom says your phone is off. Did you see the link I sent for the Sorrento villa? Let me know what you think of the terrace. It's wild. Eleanor stared at Julian's name. It's wild. She deleted the text from Julian. She deleted the missed calls. She did not reply to her mother. She walked to the small stainless steel sink in the corner of the room, turned on the faucet, and held her dry, cold hands under the water. The heat was slow to come, just like at home, but when it did, she kept her hands under the stream until the skin turned a deep, angry red. The first phase of her life had ended in the driveway this morning. She wasn't going to save $50 a week for 3 years. She wasn't going to wait. She dried her hands on a brown paper towel, threw it in the metal bin, and walked out into the corridor toward room 3. Her shoes didn't make a sound. The automatic doors of the food mart parted with a pneumatic hiss, releasing a wave of warm, stale air that smelled of fried chicken from the deli counter and floor wax. Eleanor pushed a shopping cart with a squeaking front wheel down the main aisle. The store was brightly lit, the harsh fluorescent tubes overhead reflecting off the polished white floor in long, glittering streaks. Under the glare, her reflection in the glass of the frozen food cases looked washed out, her coat hanging loose around her shoulders. She stopped in the baking aisle. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. Martha, 4:52 p.m. Don't forget the organic honey for your father's throat. The cheap one makes him cough. Also the bakery muffins, the blueberry ones. Make sure they aren't the day-old ones. And see if they have those shortbread biscuits Julian likes. I want to put them in the box we're mailing him tomorrow. Eleanor stared at the screen. She looked up at the shelf in front of her. The imported shortbread biscuits were in a distinctive red tartan box. Price, $8.99. The organic honey was on the next aisle. Price, $12.49. The blueberry muffins from the bakery section. Price, $6.50. She opened her banking application on her phone. She logged in using her thumbprint, checking $12.40, savings $100. She had transferred $100 from her savings to her checking earlier in the afternoon, leaving her savings count, the one her parents had cleaned out, with a balance of exactly $0.00. The total for the items her mother had requested, including the special broth with the green label, would come to $31.47. If she bought them, her checking account would be reduced to $20.67. She would not have enough gas to get to work on Friday morning. Eleanor stood in the aisle for a full minute, her hand resting on the cold metal bar of the shopping cart. A woman with 2 small children pushed past her, the kids whispering and reaching for a box of sugary cereal. Eleanor didn't see them. She was calculating the cost of compliance. If she bought the items, she would maintain the peace for another 24 hours. Martha would smile. Arthur would have his tea, and Julian's care package would be sent to his high-rise in Chicago, paid for by the sister he hadn't spoken to since Christmas. If she did not buy them, the friction would begin. She turned her cart away from the baking aisle. She walked to the dairy section at the back of the store. The dairy cases hummed, a high-pitched, vibrating sound that seemed to drill straight into her temples. The air here was cold, smelling of sour milk and cardboard. She reached into the case and took a single 6-ounce tub of plain Greek yogurt. Price, $1.20. She walked to the checkout lanes. She chose the self-service register. She scanned the single tub of yogurt. The machine beeped, a sharp, cheerful sound. Total $1.29. She inserted her debit card into the slot. The machine processed the payment, printed a small 3-inch receipt, and fell silent. She placed the yogurt in her coat pocket and walked out of the store, leaving the empty shopping cart by the door. The drive home was quiet. She kept the car's heater off, the cold air from the vents keeping her awake as she navigated the darkening streets. By the time she pulled into the gravel driveway, the sky was a deep, bruised purple. The porch light was off. She walked up the wooden steps, her shoes crunching on the frozen boards, and unlocked the front door. The house was warm, far warmer than the 62 degrees they had agreed upon. She could hear the furnace roaring in the basement, a heavy, expensive rumble. In the living room, the television was on. Arthur was sitting in his recliner, his head tilted back, his mouth slightly open as he snored. Martha was in the kitchen, standing by the stove. She was stirring a pot of tomato soup, the red liquid bubbling slowly. "Did you get it?" Martha asked without looking up. She kept her eyes on the pot, her wooden spoon tracing slow circles in the red soup. "They were out of the green label broth," Eleanor said. She took off her coat and hung it on the wooden peg behind the kitchen door. Martha's hand paused. She turned her head, her eyes scanning Eleanor's hands, then the counter behind her. "And the rest?" Martha asked, her voice dropping its soft, domestic warmth, returning to that thin, sharp register. "The honey? The biscuits for Julian?" "I didn't get them," Eleanor said. She took the tub of Greek yogurt out of her coat pocket and placed it in the refrigerator. Martha set the wooden spoon down on the ceramic spoon rest. It made a wet tapping sound. "What do you mean you didn't get them?" "Eleanor, I told you your father's throat was raw, and Julian's box has to go out tomorrow morning if it's going to reach him before he leaves for Italy." "My card was declined," Eleanor said. She stood by the refrigerator, her back straight, looking directly at her mother. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the morning. It was heavy, thick with things that could not be said. Martha's eyes widened slightly. Her hand went to the collar of her blouse, her fingers fluttering against the fabric. She knew why Eleanor's card would be declined if she had tried to draw from the joint account. She knew exactly how much money had been in that account, and she knew exactly where those $8,450 had gone. But she couldn't say it. To ask why was it declined would require acknowledging that she had looked at the balance. It would require explaining why the balance was suddenly $12. It would require admitting, in the middle of the kitchen, that she and Arthur had taken their daughter's savings to pay for their son's luxury vacation. She looked at Eleanor, searching her face for anger, for tears, for the usual defensive outburst. But Eleanor's face was a mask of perfect, polite blankness. "Declined?" Martha whispered, her voice faltering for a fraction of a second. That's impossible. Surely you must have made a mistake at the register. Did you use the right PIN?" "I used the right PIN," Eleanor said. The screen said insufficient funds. I only had enough for my yogurt. Arthur's snoring stopped in the next room. The television volume was suddenly very loud. A commercial for lawnmowers filling the gap in their conversation. Martha looked down at the stove. Her shoulders had gone stiff. Her neck red beneath her gray hair. "Well," she said, her voice tight and high, "you must have some money in your checking. You just got paid last week." "I had to pay my car insurance," Eleanor said smoothly, "and the utility contribution." Martha didn't answer. She picked up the wooden spoon again, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle, and began to stir the soup so fast that a few red drops splashed over the side of the pot, sizzling on the hot burner. "We'll have to go to the store tomorrow then," Martha muttered, her back to Eleanor. "Your father can't go without his honey. We'll find another way." "Okay," Eleanor said. She walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs to her room, leaving her mother alone with the sound of the bubbling soup and the weight of the empty space where the money used to be. The heat in Eleanor's bedroom was dry and smelled of old wallpaper adhesive and the wool blankets she kept stored in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. The radiator under the sloped ceiling hissed, a long, drawn-out shh that was occasionally interrupted by a sharp, metallic clink from the pipes. She was standing by her small wooden dresser, preparing her uniform for Thursday. Her physical routine was deliberate. She took her teal-colored medical scrubs from the hanger, shook them out with a single crisp snap of her wrists, and laid them flat on her bed. She pulled a black lint roller across the fabric. Rip, rip, rip. The sticky paper gathered a few stray gray hairs and a tiny piece of white thread. She peeled the dirty layer off, exposing a fresh, sticky sheet, and began on the trousers. From the hallway downstairs, she heard the heavy, uneven creak of the stairs. It was a slow progress. One step, a long pause, then the next. Arthur's bad knees made the second floor a rare destination. For the past 2 years, he had only come up to her room when he needed help moving a heavy box of old tax records, or when the attic hatch in her closet ceiling needed to be checked for leaks. The creaking stopped at the top landing. A moment later, there was a soft, hesitant tap on her door. "Eleanor, come in," Eleanor said. She didn't stop lint rolling her trousers. The door opened slowly. Arthur stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the narrow opening. He was still wearing his flannel robe, but he had tucked his hands into his pockets, a defensive gesture he used when he was uncomfortable. In his right hand, he clutched the gray nylon sleeve of his digital blood pressure monitor. "Your mother said you were up here," Arthur said. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning her small desk, her neatly made bed, and the single window that looked out onto the dark backyard. "I'm preparing my uniform," Eleanor said. "Yes. Right." Arthur cleared his throat, a dry, raspy cough. He shuffled a few inches closer, his slippers dragging on the faded green carpet. He looked down at the blood pressure monitor in his hand, then back up at her. "Your mother she was a bit concerned about what you said in the kitchen. About the card." Eleanor flipped her scrub trousers over. She ran the roller down the back of the left leg. Rip, rip. She thought maybe you should call the credit union, Arthur continued, his voice tentative, searching. Sometimes those machines at the food mart have a glitch. Or maybe the bank put a hold on the account. You know, for security. They do that when they see suspicious activity. The credit union didn't put a hold on it, Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any inflection that could be interpreted as anger or hurt. Arthur shifted his weight, his knee joint making a dry click. Well, how do you know? Did you call them? I checked the mobile app, Eleanor said. The transaction ledger was clear. The money was transferred yesterday afternoon. Arthur's throat moved as he swallowed. His fingers tightened around the gray nylon cuff. He looked at the framed photograph on her dresser. A picture of her, Julian, and their parents at a county fair 15 years ago. Julian was holding a blue ribbon. Eleanor was standing slightly behind him, almost entirely in his shadow. Transferred? Arthur repeated, his voice dropping into a lower, tighter register. Where did it go? To a joint-linked checking account, Eleanor said. She stopped the lint roller. She turned her head and looked directly at her father. The one ending in 4902. Arthur's face did not change, but a small, tight muscle in his jaw twitched once. He knew the number. It was the account he and Martha used for their daily expenses. The one they had used to wire the $8,450 to the luxury travel agency in Chicago. He had expected her to be crying. He expected her to demand to know why they had taken her money. He and Martha had spent 40 minutes in the kitchen discussing how they would handle her anger, how Martha would explain that it was just a short-term loan for Julian's once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and how they would absolutely pay her back as soon as Arthur's pension adjustment cleared in the spring. They had prepared their defense, but they had not prepared for this level of absolute frozen calm. Well, Arthur said, his eyes darting to her desk, then down to his slippers. I'm sure there's been some sort of misunderstanding. Your mother and I will look into it. Tomorrow, we'll check the statements. No need, Eleanor said. The bank confirmed the transfer was authorized. It's done. Arthur stared at her. The silence in the room became absolute, save for the dry hiss of the radiator. He wanted to say something else, to offer an excuse, to suggest a solution, but her lack of emotion left him with no purchase. He was like a man trying to climb a sheer wall of glass. He held up the gray blood pressure cuff. My arm's been tingling, he said, his voice returning to its familiar, slightly pathetic whine. Since dinner, your mother said my pressure might be up again. She wanted you to check it. Normally, Eleanor would have immediately dropped what she was doing. She would have taken the cuff, gently wrapped it around his thick, hairy arm, pumped it up, and listened with her stethoscope. She would have gone downstairs to get him a glass of water, and his evening pills, adjusting his pillow in the recliner before she went back to her own chores. She looked at the cuff in his hand. The instructions are printed on the sleeve, Dad, Eleanor said. She picked up her scrub top and began to fold it into a neat, small square. You just wrap it 2 inches above the elbow. Keep your arm level with your heart and press the blue button. It's fully automatic. Arthur's mouth opened slightly. He looked at the cuff, then at her. But you usually do it. You know how to read the pulse rate. What if the machine gives a bad reading? If the screen shows an error code, just press the button again, Eleanor said. She placed the folded scrub top on top of the trousers. I need to get some sleep. I have an early shift. Arthur stood there for 5 seconds. His large shoulders hunched. He looked smaller than he had when he walked in. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the gravity in his own house had changed just slightly, and he didn't know how to walk anymore. Right, he said quietly. Well, good night, Eleanor. Good night, Dad. He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor waited until she heard his slow, creaking descent down the stairs. Once she was sure he was back on the first floor, she sat down at her small desk. She opened her planner. She was doing a physical calculation of her labor. Arthur's blood pressure medication, the generic lisinopril, had 6 tablets left in the orange plastic bottle on the kitchen counter. Usually, Eleanor logged into the credit union's online pharmacy portal on Thursday evenings to authorize the monthly refill, which took 5 days to arrive by mail. If she did not log in tomorrow, the medication would run out next Tuesday. Arthur did not know the password to the portal. Martha did not know how to navigate the website. She had tried once and had become so frustrated by the 2-factor authentication that she had thrown her tablet on the couch and told Eleanor to just handle it. Eleanor looked at the calendar page for next week. She picked up her pen. She did not write order Dad's meds on Thursday Square. She left it blank. The kitchen was still in deep shadow when Eleanor turned on the small light above the stove at 5:30 Thursday morning. The single bulb cast a narrow amber circle over the counter, leaving the rest of the room in a quiet gray dusk. She stood at the counter, preparing her lunch. Her physical routine was silent. She opened the refrigerator, the rubber seal releasing with a soft, sticky pop. She reached past the jar of expensive imported preserves and the carton of egg substitutes her mother bought for Arthur's cholesterol, pulling out a plastic container of leftover turkey and a half-empty jar of yellow mustard. She took 2 slices of generic white bread from the bag. With the flat edge of a butter knife, she spread the mustard in a thin, precise layer, ensuring it reached all 4 corners of the bread. She laid 3 thin slices of turkey on top, folded them over to fit the square shape, and pressed the sandwich closed. She didn't make a second sandwich. Usually she made a turkey wrap for Arthur's lunch, even though he was retired. He liked to have a wrap ready in the fridge, so he didn't have to fuss with making food while he watched his morning programs. Today, she put the turkey and the mustard back in the refrigerator. She placed her sandwich into a blue plastic container, snapped the lid shut with 4 distinct clicks, and slid it into her canvas tote bag. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Eleanor didn't look up. She kept her hands on the zipper of her bag. Martha walked into the kitchen. It was unusually early for her. She normally slept until 7:30, leaving Eleanor to handle the morning routine alone. She was wearing her thick, quilted green robe. her gray hair pinned back with a plastic claw clip that was missing 2 prongs. In her hand, she held a crisp green $20 bill.
"Good morning, Elle,"
Martha said, her voice carrying a soft morning hoarseness. She didn't look Eleanor in the eye. Instead, she focused on the canvas tote bag on the counter. "You're up early." "The usual time," Eleanor said. Martha stepped into the small circle of amber light. She placed the $20 bill on the clean laminate counter, smoothing it down with the flat of her thumb. "I was thinking about what you said last night," Martha said, her voice dropping into a gentle, confidential tone. "About your card. It's so stressful when those banking systems have a glitch. Your father and I were talking, and we realized how tight things must be for you with your car acting up. I found this in my purse. I want you to have it. For gas." She pushed the bill 2 inches closer to Eleanor. The green paper was crisp, smelling faintly of lavender perfume from Martha's handbag. Eleanor looked at the bill. She knew what this was. It was a bridge. Martha was constructing a narrative, a comfortable, polite fiction where Eleanor's empty account was the result of a banking glitch, rather than a systematic theft of her entire life savings. By offering $20, Martha was performing the role of the doting, supportive mother, easing her own guilt while simultaneously trying to buy Eleanor's compliance. If Eleanor accepted the money, Martha would feel they had reached an understanding. The debt would be quietly forgotten, replaced by this $20 gesture of goodwill. Eleanor picked up the bill. She folded it in half. Then she folded it in half again, pressing this crease flat with her fingernail until it was a small, tight square. She slid it into the pocket of her teal scrubs. "Thank you," Eleanor said. A look of visible relief passed over Martha's face. Her shoulders dropped 1/2 inch, the tension leaving her neck. She smiled, her eyes crinkling behind her reading glasses. "Of course, sweetie, we're family. We look out for each other," Martha said, her voice warming instantly. "Now, since you have the gas money, could you run by the bakery after your shift? Your father was so disappointed about those blueberry muffins yesterday, and we really do need that chamomile tea. My chest was so tight last night." She paused, waiting for the nod. Eleanor zipped her canvas bag. The metal teeth of the zipper made a sharp, clean sound in the quiet kitchen. She was doing the math. The $20 bill represented exactly 5.1 gallons of gas at the current price. That was enough to run her car to the clinic and back for another 5 days, even with the alternator drawing extra power. The blueberry muffins at the bakery were $6.50. The chamomile tea at the pharmacy was $8. If she bought them, she would spend $14.50 of the $20. She would be left with $5.50, barely enough for a gallon and a half of gas. She would be right back where she started by Friday morning, completely dependent on them for another handout. "I'll see what I can do," Eleanor said. It was the phrase she always used when they made demands she didn't want to meet. In the past, it had meant, "I will stretch myself to the absolute limit to make sure you get what you want." Today, it meant nothing at all. "Oh, thank you, darling." Martha said, already turning back toward the hallway. "You're a lifesaver. Your father will be so pleased." She shuffled back toward the stairs, her slippers scuffing against the carpet. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a moment, her hand resting on her canvas bag. She reached into her pocket and touched the small, stiff square of the $20 bill. She would drive straight to the gas station at the corner of Main and Elm. She would put exactly $20 of regular unleaded into her tank. She would not go to the bakery. She would not go to the pharmacy. She picked up her bag, turned off the small light above the stove, and let the kitchen sink back into the gray, cold shadow of the morning. The mailbox at the end of the gravel driveway was cold, its galvanized steel surface coated in a thin, greasy film of road salt and soot from the evening commuter traffic. Eleanor performed her daily physical routine. She reached out, pulled the metal hatch down with a sharp, squeaking protest from the rusted hinge, and reached inside. Her bare fingers swept the curved bottom of the box, gathering a small stack of envelopes. Slid, pull, sort. She stood by the curb in the gathering twilight, the white exhaust from her idling Toyota slowly drifting across the lawn like ground fog. The mail was predictable. A flyer for a local carpet cleaning service, a supermarket circular with bright red coupon borders, and a windowed envelope from the gas company with a pink stripe along the edge, the second notice for the overdue balance on the winter heating bill. She walked up the driveway, her boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The house looked dark, save for the single yellow light in the dining room window. When she opened the back door, she was met by the smell of packing tape, that sharp, synthetic adhesive scent that always made her throat itch. Martha was sitting at the dining room table. In front of her was a medium-sized cardboard shipping box. The top flaps were open, folded back to reveal the contents: a pair of thick, hand-knitted gray socks, a small jar of homemade strawberry jam with a handwritten label, and a stack of old photographs secured with a thick rubber band. In the center of the box was a distinct square empty space. Martha was holding a heavy dispenser of clear packing tape, her thumb resting on the serrated metal teeth of the blade. She looked up as Eleanor entered, her eyes immediately dropping to Eleanor's hands. There were no plastic grocery bags. There was no white paper bakery sack. "Eleanor?" Martha said, her voice hovering in a tight, suspended register. "Did you get the biscuits? I've been waiting to tape this up. The postal truck leaves the main branch at 6, and I wanted to make sure Julian got this before his flight on Monday." Eleanor set her canvas bag down on the hallway bench. She reached into her scrub pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of 2 coins. She walked into the dining room, stood by the table, and placed a dime and a nickel on the dark wood next to the tape dispenser. The 15 cents made a tiny metallic clink as they settled. "I didn't get them," Eleanor said. Martha stared at the 2 small coins, her forehead puckered, her glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of her nose. "What is this?" "Your change," Eleanor said. The regular unleaded was $3.89 a gallon. I put exactly 5.09 gallons in the tank. It came to $19.85. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. In the living room, the television was muted, but the blue light from the screen flickered across the doorway, casting long, jumping shadows on the wall. Arthur was standing in the archway, his hand resting on the door frame, his face dark and shadowed. "What about my muffins, Eleanor?" Arthur asked, his voice low and gravelly. "My stomach's been sour since noon. I was counting on those." "The gas came first," Eleanor said. Martha's hand tightened around the plastic handle of the tape dispenser. A small, white line of tension appeared around her lips. She wanted to yell. She wanted to tell Eleanor that she was being selfish, that she was ruining Julian's package, that she was neglecting her father's health. But she was trapped. She had given Eleanor the $20 bill under the explicit performative guise of gas money. She had called it a gift to help with her bank glitch. If she got angry now, if she demanded to know why Eleanor hadn't bought the muffins and the biscuits first, she would have to admit that the $20 had never been a gift at all. She would have to admit it was a transaction, a bribe to keep the invisible wheels of the house turning. She would have to explain why her daughter's savings account was empty in the first place. She looked at the 15 cents on the table. "Well," Martha said, her voice thin and trembling slightly as she forced a tight, polite smile. You must have had some of your own money, Eleanor. Surely you could have covered the biscuits. It's only $8. We would have settled up with you on Friday. My account has $12.14, Eleanor said, her voice remaining perfectly even. A smooth pane of glass. The bank said the balance was correct. Arthur let out a sharp, wet breath through his nose and turned back into the living room, the floorboards groaning under his retreat. Martha looked down at the empty space in the cardboard box. Her fingers reached out and touched the edge of the hand-knitted socks, straightening them with a nervous, repetitive motion. "I see," Martha whispered. "Well, I suppose we'll just have to send the box as it is. It's so disappointing. Julian was so looking forward to those biscuits. He says they don't sell that brand in the city." She picked up the roll of tape. Eleanor stood by the table, observing the physical layout of the room. She was doing an internal calculation. The box weighed approximately 4 pounds. To ship it to Chicago via priority mail would cost $15.75. Usually, Martha would leave the box on the hallway table with a note. "Elle, please take this to the post office during your lunch break." Eleanor would pay for the postage out of her own pocket, and Martha would promise to get her back on the weekend. A promise that was always forgotten by Sunday evening. If she took the box tomorrow, she would have to spend $15.75. But her account had $12.14. "Are you going to the post office tomorrow?" Eleanor asked. Martha paused, her hand hovering over the box. "Well, I was hoping you could do it, sweetie. My neck is still so stiff, and you know how I hate driving the minivan in the afternoon traffic." "I have a double shift tomorrow," Eleanor said. "I won't be off until 8 in the evening. The post office closes at 5. Martha's hand fell to the table. She looked up. her expression a mix of rising annoyance and genuine confusion. A double shift? But you didn't say anything about a double shift. Who's going to make your father's dinner? There's soup in the pantry, Eleanor said. She picked up her canvas bag from the bench and began to walk up the stairs. She didn't wait for Martha's response. She didn't listen to the sudden, urgent whispering that broke out between her parents in the dining room the moment her foot hit the third step. She just climbed, her movements slow and steady, her shadow growing longer and darker against the yellowed wallpaper of the stairwell as she moved toward the cold quiet of the second floor. The wind had risen by 11 o'clock Thursday night, rattling the loose aluminum storm window on the western side of Eleanor's bedroom. The drafts in this house were old friends. They knew exactly which seams in the drywall to whistle through, carrying the scent of dry leaves and road dust into the small, dark room. Eleanor sat at her small pine desk, the blue light from her 5-year-old laptop casting her shadow against the sloped ceiling. She performed her physical routine. She reached into her top drawer and pulled out a manila folder labeled Personal Tax. Inside was her original birth certificate, her Social Security card, and her high school diploma. The paper of the birth certificate was heavy, slightly yellowed at the edges, and felt like dry parchment under her fingers. Unfold, scan, type. She was opening a new checking account. She had chosen an online-only bank, one with no physical branches within 300 miles of her town. She used her phone to take a photograph of her driver's license, aligning the plastic card within the green digital brackets on the screen. The camera flashed, a brief, blinding blink in the dark room. She filled out the security questions. What was the name of your first pet? She typed. None. In what city did you meet your spouse? She typed. None. What was the make of your first car? She typed Toyota. Once the application was submitted, she did not link the new account to her old credit union profile. She didn't want any digital trail that could be traced from the joint account Martha and Arthur held. When her next direct deposit was processed on Friday morning, 90% of her paycheck would route directly to this new silent vault. Only her $200 utility contribution would land in the old checking account. She opened the clinic's employee portal on her screen. She was doing an internal calculation of her time and physical output. On the screen, the weekend schedule was a grid of red squares, open shifts that her coworkers had vacated for the upcoming holiday weekend. No one wanted to work the holiday. Friday, her scheduled shift was 8 hours, but the evening urgent care shift was open. She clicked Request to cover. That would make it 12 hours. Saturday, an 8-hour morning triage shift was open. She clicked Request to cover. Sunday, a 10-hour holiday eve shift was open. She clicked Request to cover Monday. The clinic was offering double time and a half for the 8-hour Memorial Day emergency rotation. She clicked Request to cover. In total, she was requesting 38 hours of work over the next 4 days. At her base rate of $18.50, with the overtime and holiday multipliers, she would earn $1,110 before taxes in a single weekend. but the calculation went deeper than the money. If she worked 38 hours, she would only be in the house to sleep. She would not be there to prepare Arthur's low-sodium meals. She would not be there to monitor the red, puffy skin of his left ankle, which had begun to show the early signs of stasis dermatitis. She would not be there to drive Martha to her weekly physical therapy appointment on Friday afternoon. She would not be there to clean the kitchen, to empty the trash, or to make sure the furnace didn't run too hot. She would be a ghost, present only in the quiet creak of the floorboards at midnight. She clicked the final submit button on the schedule requests. The screen flickered green, pending manager approval. A second later, a notification popped up. Approved. Her manager, desperate for holiday coverage, had accepted the requests instantly. Her phone, resting on the wooden desk next to her laptop, vibrated with a short double buzz. It was a notification from the family group chat. Eleanor picked it up, the screen illuminated, showing 3 new messages. Julian, 11:14 p.m. Yacht is locked in. Sorrento is going to be unreal. Thanks, Mom and Dad, for the assist. Seriously, you guys are the absolute best. I owe you one. Martha, 11:16 p.m. Of course, darling. We are so happy we could help. You work so hard, you deserve to have a beautiful trip. Your father and I are so proud of you. Have a safe flight tomorrow. Arthur, 11:17 p.m. Enjoy it, son. Take lots of photos of the ruins. They were conversing in the group chat, knowing Eleanor was a recipient, knowing her phone was active. It was a performative display of family harmony, a desperate attempt by Martha and Arthur to normalize the transaction, to behave as though the money had simply appeared from a benevolent family fund. They were waiting to see if she would reply. They wanted some sign that she was still part of the circle, that her silence in the kitchen had been nothing more than a passing mood. Eleanor stared at the green text bubble from Julian. I owe you one. He had never paid back a single dollar he had borrowed from her during college. He had never paid back the $400 she gave him for his car repair 3 years ago. She tapped the top of the group chat screen. She scrolled past the list of members, Martha, Arthur, Julian, Eleanor, and stopped at the notification settings. She tapped mute notifications. She selected indefinitely. She placed the phone face down on the desk. The blue light from her laptop screen reflected off the glass back of the device, cold and still. She stood up, walked to her bed, and pulled the heavy wool blanket up to her chin. The room was freezing, the wind outside howling through the bare oak branches. But she didn't get up to adjust the thermostat. She lay in the dark, her eyes open, listening to the quiet, rhythmic rattle of the storm window, waiting for the morning to come. The silence of the house at 6:15 from Friday morning was absolute. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, her coat already zipped to her chin. The only light came from the open refrigerator, which threw a sharp blue-white rectangle across the faded linoleum. She performed her physical routine. She reached for her stainless steel travel mug, which she had washed and dried the night before. Usually, her morning routine involved filling the 12-a-cup glass carafe of the drip coffee maker, measuring out 6 scoops of dark roast, and setting the automatic timer so the kitchen would smell of hazelnut when Arthur came downstairs. Today, she didn't touch the coffee maker. She pulled the black electrical cord from the wall outlet, wrapping the thick wire tightly around the plastic base of the machine. She left the damp, gray filter from yesterday's brew sitting in the plastic basket, the dark grounds starting to smell faintly of mold. She turned to get her keys from the wooden hook by the back door. A small yellow sticky note was pressed against the brass ring of her keychain. The handwriting was Martha's, hurried, slanting loops written with a purple felt tip pen. Elle, don't forget my PT at 2 p.m. We need to leave by 1. 30 because of the road construction on Route 4. Put the pork chops in the slow cooker with the cream of mushroom soup before you leave for your shift. Love, Mom. Eleanor stared at the yellow paper. Yesterday evening, standing in the dining room, she had looked her mother in the eye and said, I have a double shift tomorrow. I won't be off until 8 in the evening. Martha had heard her. They had argued about who would make Arthur's dinner. Yet the note was here. It was a familiar, quiet mechanism of control. In this house, Eleanor's words did not register as physical facts. They were treated as temporary complaints, minor inconveniences that would inevitably dissolve when confronted with the family's established routine. By writing the note, Martha was resetting the reality of the household to its default state. Eleanor would drive. Eleanor would cook. Eleanor would adjust. Eleanor peeled the sticky note off her key ring. She did not crumple it. She did not throw it in the trash. She simply pressed the adhesive back against the counter, right next to the unplugged coffee maker, where the purple ink was bright under the gray morning light filtering through the window. She took her keys, slipped them into her pocket, and walked out into the cold. The clinic was exceptionally busy by 1:15 Friday afternoon. The triage desk was a constant hum of ringing telephones, the high-pitched chirp of the fax machine, and the steady, rhythmic shuck-shuck of the automatic hand sanitizers dispenser by the double doors. The smell of antiseptic and wet winter coats hung heavy in the waiting room. Eleanor sat in the small break room, her back to the window. She had 5 minutes left of her lunch break. On the laminate table in front of her sat her blue plastic container, empty save for a few crumbs of wheat bread. Her phone, sitting face down on the table, began to vibrate. It didn't ring. She had kept the silent mode active since Thursday night, but the low, rhythmic buzz against the plastic tabletop was loud enough to draw a glance from Kelly, the triage nurse who was eating a salad at the other end of the table. The screen read, "Home." Eleanor did not pick it up. She watched the phone slide 2 inches to the left, propelled by its own internal motor before the call went to voicemail. 3 minutes later, the screen lit up again. Text Martha, 1:18 p.m. Eleanor, where are you? We need to leave in 12 minutes. I'm standing by the front door with my coat on. My shoulder is agonizing. Please hurry. Eleanor picked up her plastic container. She walked to the small sink in the corner of the break room and rinsed it under the hot tap, her fingers turning pink under the steaming water. She was doing an internal calculation. If she left the clinic now to drive her mother to the appointment, she would lose her afternoon hours, exactly 5.5 hours of work, including the overtime multiplier. That represented $152.63. Additionally, she would have to explain to her manager, Dr. Evans, why she was leaving in the middle of a double shift during a holiday weekend. Dr. Evans was a reasonable man, but his patience with family emergencies was wearing thin, especially since Kelly had already called out for Saturday. If she stayed, Martha would miss her appointment. The physical therapy clinic had a strict 48-hour cancellation policy. They would charge Martha's insurance a $50 fee for a no-show. Arthur would have to drive her instead. Arthur's cataracts made the afternoon sun glare nearly blinding for him, and he hated driving the heavy old minivan. It would cause a quiet, bitter argument between them in the car. They would blame Eleanor for the rest of the weekend. They would say she was being difficult. Eleanor dried her plastic container with a paper towel. She snapped the lid back on and placed it in her canvas bag. Her phone buzzed again. Text. Martha, 1:32 p.m. Your father is having to drive me. He is furious. I don't understand what you're doing, Eleanor. You knew about this appointment for 3 weeks. This is incredibly irresponsible of you. Eleanor looked at the message. You knew about this. It was the pivot of the lie. Martha had shifted the blame, transforming her own deliberate refusal to listen into a moral failure on Eleanor's part. Eleanor didn't reply. She opened the contact details for her mother's number. She scrolled down past the email address and the home address and tapped mute notifications. She did the same for her father's number. She walked out of the break room, her rubber-soled clogs making a quiet, rhythmic squeak against the polished linoleum of the hallway as she headed back to the triage desk. Her next patient was waiting in room 4. The headlights of the Corolla flickered once, then died as Eleanor turned the key to the left. The engine gave a final, metallic shudder before falling silent. She sat in the dark for a long minute. Her eyes burned from the dry, pressurized air of the clinic, and her lower back felt like a tight, hot wire. It was 8:40 Friday night. She performed her physical routine. She unclipped her ID badge from her scrub top, slid it into her canvas bag, and stepped out into the damp, cold night. She walked up the back steps, her boots heavy on the wood, and let herself into the kitchen. The house smelled of scorched soy sauce and old frying oil. The single light above the kitchen island was on, casting a yellow, greasy glare over the countertops. Sitting in the sink were 3 empty white cardboard containers from the Golden Dragon, a local Chinese takeout place, along with 2 dirty forks and a plate with a smear of brown gravy dried to its center. Martha was sitting at the kitchen table. She was still wearing her green quilted robe, but she had wrapped a thick gray shawl around her shoulders. In front of her sat a cup of black tea, cold and dark, with a thin skin of oil floating on the surface. We had to order from the Golden Dragon, Martha said. Her voice didn't carry its usual airy sweetness. It was flat, thin, and brittle. Your father's stomach is in knots. They didn't have any of the low-sodium options. and he's had to take 3 of his antacids since 7 o'clock. Eleanor took off her boots. Her feet were swollen, the elastic band of her white socks leaving deep red indentations in her skin. She placed her boots neatly on the rubber mat by the door. "I told you I was working until 8, Eleanor said. She walked to the cupboard, took down a clean glass, and filled it with cold tap water. The pipes under the sink groaned, a low, vibrating rumble. "You've worked until 8 before, Eleanor," Martha said, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "But you've always managed to put the food in the slow cooker before you left, or at least let us know. Your father waited until 5 o'clock before we realized you weren't coming home to make dinner." In the living room, the television was muted. Arthur was sitting in his recliner, his left leg elevated on a pile of faded cushions. He didn't turn his head to look at her, but as Eleanor took a sip of her water, he let out a loud theatrical sigh and shifted his weight, his knee joint making a sharp pop. "The pork chops are still in the refrigerator," Martha continued, her voice rising slightly. "They're going to spoil by tomorrow. That's $12 of meat, Eleanor. We can't afford to just throw food away." Eleanor leaned against the counter. The laminate was cold against her lower back. She was doing an internal calculation. The Golden Dragon receipt was sitting on the counter next to the bread box. Total, $38.45. If the physical therapy clinic charged the $50 no-show fee for her mother's missed appointment, their total loss for the afternoon was $88.45. Arthur's monthly pension was $1,800. Martha's Social Security check was $650. Their combined fixed expenses, the remaining mortgage on the house, their monthly prescription copays, the utility bills, and the insurance on the minivan came to $1,950 a month. That left them with exactly $500 for groceries, household supplies, and gas. And Julian's trip, the wire transfer they had made from Eleanor's savings, had been $8,450. They had no reserve left. They had no buffer. If they continued to order takeout because Eleanor was not there to prep their meals, and if they continued to incur missed appointment fees because Arthur refused to drive in the afternoon, their $500 discretionary fund would be entirely gone in less than 2 weeks. "I'm sorry you had to order out," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet, polite, and completely empty of genuine regret. It was the tone she used when a patient complained about the coldness of the stethoscope. Martha stared at her. She was looking for the crack. She wanted Eleanor to look guilty. She wanted her to say, "I'm sorry, I forgot." Or, "I was just so stressed about the bank," so that Martha could swoop in with her performative forgiveness and restore the balance of the house. But Eleanor just stood there, her face a smooth, pale mask, taking another slow sip of her water. The silence between them was thick, smelling of the scorched soy sauce from the sink. It was the sound of a question that neither of them was willing to ask. Martha wanted to ask why Eleanor was behaving this way, but to do so would require her to speak the name of the savings account. It would require her to explain why she had taken her daughter's future and handed it to her eldest son. So she kept her mouth shut, her eyes darting back to her cold cup of tea. "Well," Martha muttered, her voice dropping back into its thin, martyred register, "your father's leg is very swollen tonight. I'll need you to look at it before you go to bed. He says the skin feels very tight." "I have a 12-hour shift tomorrow," Eleanor said. "I need to get some sleep. If his leg is tight, he should keep it elevated and take his diuretic." She placed her empty glass in the sink, right next to the greasy cardboard cartons of Chinese food. "Good night," Eleanor said. She walked out of the kitchen, her socks making no sound on the stairs as she climbed up to her room, leaving the dirty dishes and the heavy, greasy smell of the takeout to sit in the dark kitchen below. The tear of the small aluminum foil packet was a sharp, clean sound in the 6 o'clock quiet of Eleanor's bedroom. She performed her physical routine. She pulled the small folded square of the isopropyl alcohol prep pad from its sleeve, the biting, antiseptic scent instantly filling the tight space under the rafters. She took her stethoscope from her desk, wrapped the wet prep pad around the silver diaphragm, and wiped it in slow, concentric circles. Swip, swip, swip! She cleaned the black rubber tubing next, pulling the pad down the length of the cord until the dust of the clinic was gone, leaving the rubber damp and smelling of spirits. She folded the stethoscope into her canvas bag, zipped her fleece jacket to her chin, and stepped out into the hallway. The house was stiflingly hot. Sometime during the night, Arthur must have crawled out of bed and pushed the thermostat up to 74. The dry, dusty heat from the floor registers carried the smell of old carpets and scorched furnace dust, making Eleanor's eyes itch as she descended the creaking wooden stairs. In the kitchen, the gray morning light fell across the sink. The greasy cardboard containers from the Golden Dragon were still sitting in the basin. The brown sauce at the bottom of the boxes now dried into a dark, leathery rind. A thin swarm of fruit flies hovered above the drain. Her parents had left them there, a silent physical protest, a monument of unwashed cardboard, meant to greet her when she came downstairs, expecting her to clear it before her shift. On the kitchen island, next to a half-empty box of tissues, sat 3 orange plastic prescription bottles. They were scattered next to a torn white envelope. On the back of the envelope, Arthur had written in his large, shaky longhand, "Eleanor, my ankles are twice their size today. I can't find my magnifying glass, and the print on these bottles is too small. Which one is the water pill?" Eleanor looked at the orange containers. The label on the middle bottle was perfectly clear. It read, "Furosemide 40 mg. Take 1 tablet daily in the morning." This was the water pill. Arthur had taken this exact medication every morning for 48 months. He knew the pill was small, round, and light pink. He knew exactly where it was kept. The note was a classic maneuver of weaponized incompetence. By pretending he couldn't read the label or find his magnifying glass, he was attempting to force Eleanor back into her role as the household's medical anchor. He wanted her to sort the pills, to bring him the glass of water, to kneel on the floor and inspect his swollen flesh. He wanted her to take responsibility for his body so that he didn't have to face the cold draft of her withdrawal. Eleanor picked up the bottle of furosemide. She held it up to the gray light of the window and swirled it gently. The small pink tablets made a dry, hollow rattle against the plastic wall. There were exactly 3 pills left. She turned the bottle around to read the small black text at the bottom of the label. Refills remaining 0. User must contact physician for renewal. She was doing an internal calculation. Usually, Eleanor would have noticed the 0 refills warning 3 weeks ago. She would have called Dr. Evans' triage nurse during her lunch break, secured the electronic renewal, and authorized the credit union's online pharmacy to ship the new 30-day supply directly to the house. The online portal copay was $5. Because she had left the portal blank on Thursday evening, no request had been sent. Since it was Saturday of a 3-day holiday weekend, the clinic's administrative staff was gone. If Arthur ran out of his diuretic on Tuesday morning, they would have to physically drive to the pharmacy, wait for the pharmacist to fax Dr. Evans' emergency service, and pay the non-portal retail copay of $25. If the fax didn't go through by Tuesday afternoon, Arthur's ankles would continue to swell. Within 48 hours of missing his dose, the fluid would begin to pool in his lungs. The emergency room copay for a congestive heart failure flare-up was $250. She placed the orange bottle back on the counter, exactly where she had found it. She picked up a black ballpoint pen from the pencil cup by the telephone. On the torn envelope, directly beneath her father's shaky handwriting, she wrote, "The pink pill is the diuretic. There are 3 left. You are out of refills." She laid the pen across the envelope. She did not touch the other 2 pill bottles. She did not wash the greasy Chinese food containers in the sink. She did not turn the thermostat down from 74 degrees. She grabbed her canvas bag, walked out the back door, and stepped into the freezing gray morning. As she backed her car out of the driveway, the tires crunching over the frozen gravel, she looked at the second-floor window of her parents' bedroom. The white lace curtains were still drawn tight, but the edge of the fabric twitched once, a tiny dark gap appearing for a fraction of a second before the lace fell back into place. Eleanor kept her eyes on her rearview mirror and drove toward the main road, the car's cold alternator whining in the quiet morning air. The clinic's back office was quiet at 3:30 Saturday afternoon. Most of the administrative staff had gone home for the 3-day weekend, leaving the nurses' station under the low yellow hum of the overhead track lights. Eleanor stood by the heavy industrial laser printer in the corner. She performed her physical routine. She reached into her canvas bag, pulled out a blue sterile pen, and waited for the printer to finish its cycle. The machine gave a low mechanical whir, followed by a heavy chunk clack as it spat 3 warm, freshly printed pages into the plastic tray. The scent of hot toner and warm paper rose into the cool air. Eleanor took the sheets. They were her official application forms for the Oregon State Board of Nursing. The interstate licensing transfer she had been putting off for 18 months because her mother had insisted she was needed here to help Arthur with his physical therapy transition. She laid the papers on the laminate counter. With a steady, unhurried hand, she signed her name on the bottom line of the third page. Eleanor Vance, CMA. The blue ink was bright and clean against the white paper. She folded the pages into thirds, slid them into a large manila envelope, and sealed the metal clasp with a firm press of her thumb. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. A new voicemail notification was glowing on the lock screen. She didn't listen to the audio. Instead, she tapped the transcription button, her eyes scanning the blocks of text that her phone had converted into flat gray font. Martha, 2:41 p.m. Eleanor, sweetie, it's Mom. Your father went down to the Walgreens, and they're saying there are no refills left on his pink pill. The girl behind the counter was very rude to him. She said, "We have to pay $25 for a temporary 5-day supply, or wait until Tuesday for the doctor's office to call them back. I know you're working, but could you just call Dr. Evans' nurse? You know them so well. They'll do the renewal for you in a second. Call me back when you get this, darling." Eleanor stared at the transcription. Call me back, darling. The language was sugary, carrying that performative warmth her mother used when she was trying to smooth over a rough patch without actually addressing the stones beneath it. It was the same tone Martha used when she was asking Eleanor to clean the gutters or drive Arthur to his colonoscopy. She was trying to use the old currency. For 10 years, Eleanor had accepted this currency. She had traded her time, her energy, and her physical labor for these small verbal crumbs of maternal affection. She had let them call her sweetie and darling, while they spent every spare dollar of their pension on Julian's law school tuition, Julian's apartment deposits, and Julian's luxury European vacations. Now the exchange rate had changed. Eleanor logged into her new online banking application. She was doing an internal calculation. Her direct deposit from the clinic had cleared at midnight. Her net pay for the week, which included the overtime she had worked during the previous cycle, was $924.50. The credit union joint account had automatically received her $200 utility contribution, leaving the rest of her earnings to flow directly into her new silent vault. Her new balance was $1,036.64. It was a small fraction of the $8,450 they had stolen, but it was hers. It was completely invisible to them. It was a digital wall they could not climb. If she called Dr. Evans' triage nurse now, the renewal would be sent to the pharmacy within 10 minutes. Arthur would get his pink pills, the $25 fee would be bypassed, and the household would return to its comfortable, parasitic equilibrium. If she did nothing, the pharmacy would refuse the refill. Arthur's ankles would continue to swell. He would have to spend $25 of his own cash for the emergency 5-day supply, or face the rising panic of his own physical deterioration over the long holiday weekend. She looked at her phone screen. She tapped the trash can icon next to the voicemail transcription. The text dissolved, replaced by a clean white screen. She did not call Dr. Evans' nurse. She did not call her mother back. She slid her phone into her pocket, picked up the manila envelope containing her licensing application, and walked out of the back office toward room 6, where a patient was waiting to have their blood pressure recorded. Her rubber-soled shoes made a quiet, rhythmic squeak against the polished floor, the only sound in the long, sterile hallway. The kitchen was dark when Eleanor returned at 7:45 Saturday night. The only illumination came from the green digital display on the microwave, which pulsed 7:45 in a steady emerald glow 13. She performed her physical routine. She set her canvas bag on the bench, hung her damp winter coat on the wooden peg, and slid her clogs into their designated spot on the rubber mat. She walked to the small wooden cutting board by the bread box, took a block of generic sharp cheddar cheese from the refrigerator, and cut 3 thin slices. The dull thud, thud, thud of the knife hitting the wood was the only sound in the room. The kitchen smelled of dust and cold dishwater. The dirty Chinese food containers from Friday night had finally been moved to the trash can under the sink. But the sink itself was still greasy, a gray ring of soap scum marking where the water had drained. From the living room, Martha's slippers scuffed against the carpet. She entered the kitchen, her gray shawl wrapped so tightly around her shoulders that she looked skeletal in the dim light. "We had to pay the $25, Eleanor," Martha said. Her voice was thin, dry, and carried the high whistling edge of a boiling kettle. "Your father had to count out $5 bills from his emergency stash in his dresser." He was so embarrassed. The line behind him was all the way to the door. Eleanor placed her 3 slices of cheese onto a single wheat cracker. She didn't look up. I was in triage," Eleanor said. The clinic was short-staffed. The girl at the counter said there was no record of any nurse calling, Martha said, stepping closer, her shadow falling across the cutting board. Her eyes searched Eleanor's face, desperate for some sign of remorse, some opening to start the familiar cycle of guilt and apology. "I left you a message at 2:00. Surely you had a break. It only takes 2 minutes to make a call." "I didn't have a break," Eleanor said. She took a bite of the cracker. The dry crumb was salty on her tongue. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see into the living room. Arthur was sitting in his recliner, his left leg propped up on a plastic footstool. He had wrapped his ankle in a beige elastic tensor bandage. He had done a terrible job. The bandage was wrapped white-knuckle tight around his instep, the pale flesh of his toes turning a dull, waxy purple under the tension. Above the ankle, the wrapping was loose and bunched, slipping down his calf in lumpy, uneven layers. "Your father tried to wrap it himself," Martha said, her voice dropping into a low, trembling register. "I couldn't help him because of my shoulder. He's in so much pain, Eleanor. The skin looks so red. Could you please just unwrap it and do it properly for him? It will only take you 5 minutes." Eleanor looked at the lumpy, purple toes sticking out from the bottom of the beige bandage. She was doing an internal calculation. Because the bandage was wrapped too tightly at the bottom and too loosely at the top, it was acting as a tourniquet. It was restricting the venous return, forcing the fluid to pool in his foot rather than pushing it back up toward his heart. If he kept it wrapped like that overnight, the pressure would cause the delicate, stretched skin of his instep to blister. By Monday morning, those blisters would pop, creating open, weeping sores that would easily become infected in the dusty, warm environment of the house. She knew exactly how to fix it. She had her clinical scissors in her bag. She could unwrap it, perform a gentle lymphatic massage, and rewrap it in a perfect overlapping spiral in less than 5 minutes. But to touch his leg was to sign the contract again. It would mean she was still the nurse. It would mean her clinical skills, her energy, and her physical touch were still a free natural resource, available to be tapped whenever they ran dry. It would prove that no matter how much money they stole from her, she would still crawl to them when they whined. She looked at her mother. If the bandage is too tight, he should take it off, Eleanor said. She picked up her plate with the cheese and crackers. He shouldn't wear it if it hurts. Martha's mouth opened slightly. She looked at Eleanor as if she were speaking a foreign language. But if he takes it off, the swelling will get worse. You know that, Eleanor. You're the nurse in this house. I'm a medical assistant, Eleanor said, and I'm off the clock. She walked past her mother, her rubber-soled socks making no sound as she crossed the dining room. She climbed the stairs, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on the dark hallway above. Downstairs, the television was suddenly muted. In the heavy silence that followed, she heard the sharp, frantic whisper of her mother's voice, followed by the dry, rasping groan of her father as he reached down to pull at the Velcro straps of his bandage. Eleanor didn't look back. She entered her room, closed the door, and turned the lock, the small brass bolt sliding into the frame with a clean final click. The steam from the small stainless steel pot rose in a thin, twisting column, condensing against the cold glass of the kitchen window. Eleanor performed her Sunday morning physical routine. She stood by the stove, watching 2 white eggs roll slowly at the bottom of the boiling water. She used a metal-slotted spoon to nudge them apart. The tiny clink-clink of the shells against the metal, the only sound in the gray, silent kitchen. The air in the house was heavy, smelling faintly of the menthol rub Martha had used the night before and the sour. Metallic scent of Arthur's unwashed compression bandages sitting in the bathroom hamper. Martha entered the kitchen. She had not combed her hair. It stood out in wild gray wisps around her head, and her face looked gray and sunken in the morning light. In her hand, she held a glossy blue envelope that had been sitting on the telephone table in the hallway for 3 days. "Eleanor," Martha said. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, dry and raspy. "Your father's leg it's very bad today. The skin on his instep has blistered. 3 of them popped when he tried to put his slipper on. He can't stand up." Eleanor didn't look up from the stove. She turned the gas dial down slightly, reducing the aggressive boil to a steady, rhythmic simmer. "We called the urgent care clinic at the hospital." Martha continued, her fingers nervously creasing the edge of the blue envelope. They said because it's Sunday of a holiday weekend, the doctor on call can see him, but the copay is $250. We haven't met our annual deductible yet. She paused, waiting. Eleanor watched a small bubble cling to the side of one of the eggs. "We don't have the cash, Eleanor," Martha said, her voice dropping into a tight, desperate register. With the bank glitch, the checking account is completely empty. We don't even have enough for the gas to get him to the hospital. She took a step closer, holding out the blue envelope. "This came for you on Thursday," Martha said. "It's a pre-approved credit card offer from the credit union. It says you have a $10,000 limit. If you could just log on to their website and authorize the digital card, we can put the copay and the gas on it. We'll pay you back." "I swear, Eleanor, as soon as Julian gets back from his trip, we'll have him help us organize our accounts, and we'll get it all settled." Eleanor turned the gas off. The blue flame died with a soft shuff. She was doing an internal calculation. The credit card offer was for a platinum visa with a 24.9% variable interest rate. If she opened that account and handed the digital number to her mother, Martha would not stop at the $250 copay. Within 48 hours, she would use it to cover the gas bill, the overdue grocery tab, and likely the shipping costs for Julian's care package. Her debt-to-income ratio would spike. Her credit score, which she had kept at a pristine 760 through years of careful, quiet planning, would plummet. If her credit score dropped, she would fail the background check for the studio apartment in Portland she had already applied for. She would be locked into this house, legally and financially bound to their debts, serving as the physical buffer for their poverty while they continued to funnel their praise and their pride to Chicago. They had taken her $8,450. Now they wanted her to sign her name to high-interest debt to clean up the medical crisis they had created by spending her buffer. "I'm not opening any new credit lines," Eleanor said. She used the slotted spoon to lift one of the eggs from the water, placing it gently into a small ceramic bowl. Martha's hand holding the blue envelope trembled. The glossy paper made a sharp, dry rustling sound. "Eleanor, please," Martha whispered, the performative sweetness completely gone from her voice, replaced by a cold, sharp panic. "It's your father. He's sitting in his chair crying. He can't walk to the bathroom. Are you really going to let him sit there and develop sepsis because of some stubbornness about a bank card?" Eleanor picked up the second egg. "You have Julian's phone number," Eleanor said. The name fell into the quiet kitchen like a block of concrete. Martha froze. Her mouth opened slightly, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. "Julian is in Italy," Martha said, her voice turning high and thin with disbelief. "He's on an airplane right now, Eleanor. He can't do anything from there." "He has his banking application on his phone," Eleanor said. She placed the second egg in the bowl. "The wire transfer you sent him went through on Wednesday. He has $8,450 in his checking account. If you call him, He can wire the $250 to the urgent care clinic. Martha's face went entirely white. The glossy blue envelope slipped from her fingers, landing on the linoleum with a dull tap. She stared at Eleanor, her eyes wide behind her reading glasses, realization finally breaking through the thick defensive wall of her denial. She knew Eleanor knew. She knew there was no bank glitch. She knew the silence of the last 4 days had not been a mood, or exhaustion, or a double shift. It had been a quiet, systematic withdrawal of her life. We can't ask him for that," Martha stammered, her voice cracking as she reached out to steady herself against the edge of the kitchen island. He worked so hard for this trip, Eleanor. He's been under so much pressure at the firm. If we tell him we're in trouble, it will ruin his vacation." Eleanor picked up her bowl of eggs. "Then I suggest you find another way to pay the copay," Eleanor said. She walked past her mother, her shoes making no sound on the worn floorboards as she headed toward the hallway. Behind her, she heard the heavy, desperate sound of Martha sinking into one of the kitchen chairs, the plastic claw clip in her hair clicking against the wooden backrest as she began to weep in the gray, silent kitchen. The vinyl of the examination table in room 2 was cold and stiff under Eleanor's hand. She performed her physical routine. She took an industrial sanitizing wipe from the plastic tub on the counter. The harsh, chemical scent of citrus and bleach immediately stinging her nose. She wiped the table down in long, overlapping strokes, ensuring the wet disinfectant covered every inch of the blue vinyl. She reached to the top of the table, grabbed the edge of the white paper roll, and pulled it down. Zist, crackle, rip. The sound of the clean paper tearing against the metal cutter was loud in the small, quiet room. She folded the crumpled, used sheet into a tight ball and dropped it into the stainless steel hazardous waste bin. The heavy foot pedal clanged shut with a dull, hollow metallic ring. She leaned against the counter, her gloved hands resting on her knees as she caught her breath. It was 2:15 Sunday afternoon. Her phone, sitting next to the jar of tongue depressors, vibrated twice. She peeled off her latex-free gloves, threw them in the bin, and picked up the device. The screen showed a text from Julian. He had sent it from a layover at Munich International Airport. Julian, 2:12 p.m. Hey, El, just landed in Munich. Mom called me in a total panic. She says Dad's ankle is infected and they need $250 for the urgent care, but their accounts are frozen or something. I tried to do an international wire through my mobile app, but the credit union wants a $45 foreign transaction fee and says there's a 3-day hold for security. It's ridiculous. Can you just pay the hospital copay today, and I'll Venmo you the $250 once I get to my hotel in Sorrento on Tuesday. Let me know when it's done so I can board my connecting flight. Thanks. Eleanor stared at the glowing text. She was doing an internal calculation. Julian's base salary at his commercial real estate firm in Chicago was $112,000 a year. He lived in a loft on Michigan Avenue that cost $2,400 a month. He had a corporate credit card, a personal investment portfolio, and, as of Wednesday afternoon, $8,450 of Eleanor's life savings sitting in his primary checking account. Yet he was unwilling to pay a $45 fee to ensure his father didn't lose his foot to cellulitis. He wanted Eleanor, whose total liquid checking balance was $12.14, to cover the $250 emergency medical fee. He wanted her to dig into her pocket, to find a way, to stretch herself over the hot coals one more time so that he could board his connecting flight to Naples without the heavy, inconvenient weight of family guilt in his carry-on luggage. And he wanted to pretend. He wanted to pretend that the frozen accounts were a random banking glitch. He wanted to pretend that he had no idea where the $8,450 had come from. Even though he had been a co-signer on Eleanor's credit union account when they were teenagers and had seen her name on the joint transfer receipt. If she replied, if she said, "I don't have the money," Julian would act shocked. He would say, "What do you mean? You've been working full-time for 6 years. Where does all your money go?" Martha would chime in, calling her difficult for refusing to help during a medical crisis. If she paid it, she would have to use her emergency credit card, putting herself $250 in debt. Julian would forget to Venmo her on Tuesday. When she reminded him, he would say he was busy with the tour and would get to it next weekend. By the time he returned, the debt would be hers, absorbed into the quiet, invisible pool of her historical sacrifices. Eleanor placed her thumb on the screen. She did not type a reply. She did not explain that she was broke. She did not tell him that his luxury vacation was paved with her stolen freedom. She simply closed the messaging application. She tapped the power button on the side of her phone until the screen went dark, then slid it into the side pocket of her scrubs. Through the thin drywall of the examination room, she heard the front door of the clinic open. The chime gave a soft, high-pitched ring. "Dr. Evans?" A voice called out from the waiting room. It was Martha. Her voice was high, shaky, and carried that familiar, breathless flutter of a woman who had spent the last 3 hours preparing her performance. "Dr. Evans, please. We have an emergency. Arthur's leg. We don't have our cards on us because of a banking error, but we need someone to look at him. Please." Eleanor stood in the center of exam room 2. The citrus bleach sanitizer on the table was slowly drying, leaving the blue vinyl wet and glittering under the harsh fluorescent lights. She didn't move. She stood perfectly still, listening to the heavy, dragging scrape of her father's slippers as Arthur limped into the lobby, his deep, raspy groans echoing down the long, empty hallway of the clinic. The blue plastic clipboard was heavy and cold in Eleanor's hand. She performed her physical routine. She slid a new sterile plastic sheath over the silver probe of the digital thermometer, the plastic making a sharp, dry snap as it locked into place. She adjusted her medical pen light in her breast pocket and stepped out of exam room 2 into the bright fluorescent glare of the clinic lobby. The air in the reception area was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and damp wool. Arthur was slumped in one of the blue vinyl waiting room chairs, his face gray and covered in a thin sheen of cold sweat. His left leg was thrust out in front of him, the bare, swollen foot resting on a sheet of newspaper. Martha had laid on the floor to protect the linoleum. Martha stood at the reception counter, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped the glass partition. Dr. Evans was standing on the other side of the desk. His reading glasses slid down his nose, looking at a red error box on the billing monitor. He looked up as Eleanor entered, his expression a mix of professional neutrality and quiet discomfort. "Eleanor," Martha gasped, her voice instantly rising into that breathless, desperate flutter. She reached out toward her, her hand trembling in the empty air. "Thank God. Tell Dr. Evans. Tell him it's just a temporary bank glitch. We don't have our cards, but you can sign the form. You work here, sweetie. Just tell him we're good for it." Dr. Evans turned his eyes to Eleanor. He did not look at Martha. "Eleanor," Dr. Evans said, his voice level and professional. "Under clinic policy for holiday weekend triage, any patient without active insurance verification or a valid credit card on file must either pay the cash copay of $250 or have an active staff member sign the payroll guarantee waiver. Do you wish to sign the waiver for Mr. Vance?" The payroll guarantee waiver was a single green sheet of paper kept in the bottom drawer of the reception desk. By signing it, an employee legally authorized the clinic to deduct the full cost of the treatment, including any subsequent lab fees, which could easily reach $400, directly from their next paycheck if the patient defaulted. Eleanor stood 4 feet from the reception counter. She was doing an internal calculation. If she signed the green paper, Dr. Evans would treat Arthur immediately. He would drain the blisters, prescribe the heavy-duty oral antibiotics, and Arthur's leg would begin to heal. But $400 would be deducted from her paycheck on Friday. Her new online checking account, which currently held $1,036.64, would receive $400 less than she had planned. Her escape fund would be set back by exactly 2 weeks. Her roommates in Portland were signing the lease on the townhouse on the 15th of the month. If she did not have her full security deposit ready by then, her name would be removed from the agreement, and the spare room would be rented to another applicant. She would be stuck in this house. She would have paid $400 to remain their servant. "No, Dr. Evans," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet, clear, and perfectly steady. It carried no anger, no hesitation, and no apology. It was the same tone she used when announcing that the clinic was closing for the evening. "I won't be signing the guarantee waiver," Eleanor said. A sharp, wet gasp escaped Martha's lips. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute terror. "Eleanor," Martha whispered, her voice cracking as she leaned against the counter for support. "He is your father. His leg is blistering. He's in agony. How can you say that in front of your boss? How can you be so cruel?" Arthur's head snapped up. He stared at his daughter, his eyes bloodshot and watery with pain. For 30 years, he had treated her presence in his house as a natural law, as permanent and unyielding as the concrete slab of the garage. He had assumed that no matter how much they took from her, no matter How many times they pushed her into the shadow to make room for Julian. She would always be there to catch him when he fell. Now he was looking at a stranger. He wanted to scream. He wanted to demand his rights as her father. He wanted to tell Dr. Evans that she was an ungrateful child, but he couldn't. To explain why she was refusing to sign would require him to explain the joint savings account. It would require him to admit, under the bright fluorescent lights of her workplace, in front of the doctor who respected her, that he and his wife had stolen over $8,000 of her hard-earned money to buy their eldest son a private yacht tour in Sorrento. His mouth opened, his jaw trembling, but no sound came out. He could only stare at her with a mixture of terror and a sudden, terrible understanding of the trap they had built for themselves. Eleanor walked toward him, the blue clipboard in her hand. She performed her physical routine. She knelt on the floor beside his chair, keeping her distance so her scrubs didn't touch his damp wool coat. She wrapped the gray nylon blood pressure cuff around his thick, hairy arm, her fingers cool and efficient against his hot skin. She pressed the start button on the monitor. The machine began to hum, the cuff inflating with a slow, mechanical whir, whir, whir that squeezed his arm. "Mr. Vance," Eleanor said, her voice completely detached as she watched the digital numbers rise on the screen. "Your blood pressure is 156/98. Your heart rate is 92. Your temperature is 101.4. She stood up, pulling the cuff from his arm with a dry, ripping sound of the Velcro. "Dr. Evans," Eleanor said, turning back to the reception desk. "The patient is hypertensive and febrile. Since we cannot accept him as a triage patient due to lack of payment authorization, we must refer him to the county hospital emergency room." She placed the gray cuff back on the shelf. "The county hospital is 12 miles south on Route 4, she added, looking directly at her mother. "You'll need to make sure you have enough gas." She did not wait for them to speak. She did not look at her father's purple, swollen toes, or her mother's weeping face. She turned and walked back down the long, narrow hallway toward the sterile quiet of exam room 2, the heavy swinging door clicking shut behind her, cutting off the sound of her father's dry, rasping groans in the lobby. The screech of the clear packing tape was a sharp, vibrating tear that seemed to split the heavy midnight silence of the second floor. Eleanor performed her physical routine. She stood in the center of her small bedroom under the rafters, her hands cool and steady as she pressed the adhesive strip down the center seam of a cardboard box. She had retrieved 3 medium-sized supply boxes from the clinic's recycling bin after her shift ended. Press. Cut. She folded her 3 heavy winter sweaters, placing them neatly at the bottom of the box. She added her nursing textbooks, her clinical dictionaries, and a small wooden box that held her grandmother's silver sewing thimble, the only personal treasure she owned that had not been gifted to her by her parents. The room smelled of cardboard dust, old paper, and the cold draft from the loose storm window. She walked downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water before she lay down. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the green glow of the microwave display. On the island counter, next to the unwashed glass she had used on Friday, lay a thick white packet of paper with the blue logo of the County General Emergency Room. Martha was sitting at the dining room table in the dark. She didn't have her glasses on, and her hands were tucked into the sleeves of her gray shawl. Her body hunched forward as if she were trying to occupy as little space as possible. "They had to lance it," Martha said. Her voice was flat, hollow, and entirely stripped of its performative maternal warmth. It was the voice of a woman who had run out of scripts. The doctor said the cellulitis was deep. If we had waited another 24 hours, the infection would have reached the bone. Eleanor filled her glass with cold tap water. The pipes in the basement groaned, a low, vibrating rattle that died away slowly. "They gave us an IV antibiotic," Martha continued, her eyes fixed on the empty space in the center of the dark wooden table. "But the prescription for the oral pills, the hospital pharmacy wouldn't release them without a $40 copay. We didn't have it, Eleanor. We had to leave the hospital without his medicine." She paused. A car passed by on the road outside, its headlights sweeping a long, yellow rectangle across the kitchen ceiling before sliding away into the dark. "I called Julian from the waiting room," Martha whispered, 3 times. "He didn't answer. He sent a text message an hour ago. He said he was at a restaurant in Sorrento, and his phone battery was at 3%. He said he would call us tomorrow." The golden child. He was sitting in a cliffside restaurant overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, his pockets full of Eleanor's stolen savings, while his father sat in a vinyl chair 12 miles away with open wounds in his leg and no medicine to stop the rot. "The hospital pharmacy delivers," Eleanor said. She took a slow sip of her water. The liquid was cold and metallic. "If you call their billing office tomorrow morning, you can request a financial hardship waiver. They will mail the antibiotics without the deposit." Martha looked up. Her eyes were red, her face swollen and marked with deep lines of exhaustion. Can't you just help us this once?" "Eleanor?" Martha pleaded, her voice cracking as she reached out, her fingers catching the edge of the dining room table. "Just $40 for his medicine. He's sitting in his chair crying. He can't sleep. We'll pay you back. I swear, as soon as Julian gets back." "No," Eleanor said. She held the glass of water in her hand, her face a smooth, pale mask in the green light of the microwave. She was doing an internal calculation. She had exactly 36 hours left in this house. Her train ticket to Portland, Oregon, was already booked for Tuesday morning at 6:15. She had already packed the trunk of her Corolla with her clothes and her documents, her old car's alternator holding just enough voltage to get her to the long-term parking lot at the station. She had $12.14 left in her credit union checking account. Tomorrow morning, during her shift break, she would walk into the branch, withdraw the cash, and sign the form to close the account entirely, terminating her father's co-signer privileges. Her first paycheck from her new online account would clear on Friday morning. By then, she would be 3 states away, sitting in a spare room in Portland, looking out at the rain. Their financial collapse was complete. They owed $500 to the county emergency room, $40 to the pharmacy, $50 to the physical therapy clinic, and their utility bill was already 2 weeks overdue. Their bank account was empty. Julian would not wire them a single dime. His phone would remain at 3%, his battery conveniently dead, until his flight landed back in Chicago. They had traded their daughter's future for their son's vacation. Now they were going to have to live in the house they had built. "I'm going to bed," Eleanor said. She walked past her mother, her socks making no sound on the worn dining room carpet. She climbed the stairs, her movements slow and steady. Her shadow climbing the yellowed wallpaper of the stairwell before she disappeared into the cold quiet of the second floor. Behind her, in the dark kitchen below, she heard the soft, dry rustle of the emergency room papers as Martha picked them up. Her fingers fumbling with the stapled sheets in the green, digital dark. The fluorescent tube above the shared bathroom mirror flickered with a low, rhythmic buzz, 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 casting a cold greenish light over the yellowed laminate shelves of the medicine cabinet. Eleanor performed her physical routine. She reached into the cabinet, her fingers wrapping around the blue plastic travel case of her toothbrush and a small half-empty tube of toothpaste. She pulled her travel-sized shampoo bottle and her clinical hand cream from the top shelf, leaving the white plastic surface completely bare. She took a single piece of toilet paper, wiped a small ring of white toothpaste residue from the corner of the shelf, and dropped the paper into the wastebasket. The bathroom smelled of mint mouthwash and the sharp, clinical sting of the menthol rub Martha had been applying to Arthur's back. Through the floor register in the corner of the room, she could hear the low, wet rattle of her father's breathing from the living room below. In her scrub pocket, her fingers touched a thick envelope. Inside, $600 in cash. 6 crisp green $100 bills. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, she had driven her 1998 Corolla to Miller's Auto Salvage at the edge of town. The alternator was drawing 12 volts. The battery was dying, and the floorboards were rusted through. But the scrapyard owner had given her $600 cash for the parts. She had walked the 3 miles back to the house in the freezing afternoon air, her boots heavy on the gravel shoulder of Route 4. She hadn't felt the cold. She had simply counted her steps, watching the gray winter sky turn a deep bruised purple as she walked. She carried her small, zipped duffel bag down the stairs. The dining room was dark, but the yellow light from the kitchen island illuminated the hallway. As Eleanor reached the bottom step, she heard the hushed, frantic whisper of her mother's voice from the kitchen. Martha was standing by the window, the cordless telephone pressed tight to her ear. "Julian." "Martha, please, sweetheart," her voice cracking with a desperate, dry panic. "I know you've just landed in Rome, but we are in a terrible bind here. Your father's leg is... The skin near his heel has turned a very dark purple today, Julian. We need the medicine from the Walgreens, but they won't release it without the $40. Eleanor." "Eleanor isn't talking to us, darling." She's completely shut us out. I don't know what's wrong with her. Please, just wire us $50. Just 50, sweetheart. We took care of all your deposits. We just need a tiny bit back." She heard Eleanor's footstep on the floorboards and immediately stopped speaking. Her shoulders went stiff under her gray shawl, and she pressed the mute button with her thumb, keeping her back turned to the door. Eleanor stood in the archway, her duffel bag in her hand. She was doing an internal calculation. Her local taxi ride to the train station was booked for 5:15 tomorrow morning. The fare was $22. Her train to Portland, Oregon, departed at 6:15. She would arrive in Chicago for a 3-hour layover, then head west across the plains, crossing the Mississippi River by Tuesday night. She would have $428 cash in her pocket and $1,036 in her new online checking account when she landed on Friday morning. Her parents had no idea her car was gone. She had parked it behind the scrapyard's chain-link fence 3 miles away. To them, the driveway looked exactly as it always did in the dark. Tomorrow morning, when the taxis pulled up to the curb at 5:15, they would still be asleep in their warm, dry-heated bedroom. When they woke at 7, they would find her bedroom empty, the mattress stripped of its sheets, and her keys lying on the kitchen island. They would walk out to the driveway to find only an empty patch of gray gravel. They would have no car. Arthur could not walk. Their bank account had $12.14. Julian would not call them back. He was currently sitting in a first-class compartment on a train to Naples, his phone set to Do Not Disturb, so he could enjoy the view of the Italian countryside without the embarrassing wet whines of his parents interrupting his vacation. Martha slowly turned around. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and dark behind her reading glasses. She looked at Eleanor's duffel bag, her fingers tightening around the cordless phone. Are you working the early shift tomorrow, Eleanor?" Martha asked. Her voice carried a fragile, pathetic hope, the desperate desire to pretend that this bag was just for her clinic uniform, that everything was still normal, that her daughter was still her servant. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Very early." Martha nodded quickly, her chin trembling. "Good, well, maybe. Before you go, darling, you could just check your father's heel? Just for a second? He says the pain is very sharp tonight." "I'll be gone before you're awake," Eleanor said. She did not say, "I'm leaving." She did not say goodbye. She did not tell her mother that the car had been sold, or that her bank account was closed, or that her clinic contract had been terminated. An explanation would require energy. It would require her to participate in their drama, to listen to Martha's tears and Arthur's angry, pathetic groans. She walked past her mother, her canvas bag held tight against her side. She placed her car keys on the laminate kitchen counter, right next to the empty yellow sticky note she had left on Friday morning. The brass ring of the keychain made a small, clean clink against the laminate. She walked up the stairs, her movements slow and steady, her shadow climbing the yellowed wallpaper of the stairwell for the very last time, leaving the kitchen and her mother's silent, weeping figure to sink back into the dark below. The small digital travel clock on Eleanor's desk beeped at 4:30 Tuesday morning. A tiny, synthetic chirp, chirp, chirp that sounded incredibly thin in the black, freezing room. She performed her morning physical routine. She sat on the edge of the bare mattress, her feet immediately finding the cold floorboards. She pulled on her thickest pair of wool socks, slipped her feet into her leather winter boots, and laced them to the top eyelets. The dry, scratchy sound of the woven laces tightening was the only sound in her room. She stood up, grabbed her green canvas duffel bag and her gray nylon suitcase, and turned toward the door. Her bedroom was entirely empty. The drawers of the pine dresser were open, revealing clean, bare wood. She stepped out into the dark hallway. As she walked past her parents' closed bedroom door, she performed her final indirect interaction. Sitting on the faded green carpet next to the doorframe was Arthur's empty water glass. He had placed it there last night, as he had done every evening for 6 years, expecting her to pick it up, carry it downstairs, and return it to him filled with fresh, ice-cold water before her shift. From inside the room came the sound of his dry, raspy cough, a weak, rattling sound that died away into a heavy, uneven snore. Eleanor did not look down at the glass. She did not pick it up. She lifted her right boot and stepped completely over the empty tumbler, her heel clearing the glass rim by a fraction of an inch. She carried her bags down the dark stairs, her movements slow and deliberate, ensuring her boots did not make a single sharp creak on the wood. The kitchen was silent. In the green emerald glow of the microwave display, her car keys lay exactly where she had left them on the laminate counter. Next to them rested her father's orange prescription bottle of furosemide, containing only 2 pink tablets, and the empty yellow sticky note from Friday morning. She stood by the kitchen island, her hands gripping the handles of her bags. She was doing an internal calculation. Portland, Oregon, was 2,140 miles away. On the train, the journey would take 48 hours. At that geographic distance, her physical availability to this household would be reduced to 0. If Arthur's leg blistered again, if they ran out of medicine, if the furnace failed, or if the gas company cut the line, they could not call her to just run by. A flight from Portland back to this small town in Ohio cost $600 and took 7 hours of travel. The physical, financial, and temporal barrier she was establishing was absolute. She was no longer drawing a psychological boundary. She was placing a continental divide between herself and their entitlement. She walked to the front door, turned the deadbolt with a soft, metallic clink, and stepped out into the dark. The morning air was viciously cold, smelling of frost and wet pine needles. At the curb, the yellow headlights of the local taxi sliced through the gray twilight, the cab's engine idling with a low, wet rattle. The driver, an older man with a thick wool cap, stepped out of the car, took her green canvas bag, and placed it in the trunk. He didn't ask her any questions. He simply closed the trunk lid with a heavy, solid thud that echoed down the quiet street. Eleanor got into the back seat. The vinyl of the taxi seat was freezing and cracked, smelling of old tobacco and pine air freshener. She sat back, her hands resting in her lap, her face flat and expressionless as she looked out the window. The taxi began to move, the tires crunching over the frozen gravel, before hitting the smooth black asphalt of the main road. Through the rear window of the cab, Eleanor watched the silhouette of the house shrink into the dark. The kitchen window was a small, gray square under the bare branches of the old oak tree. The drapes were closed. The trophies on the sideboard were hidden in the dark. She did not feel a sudden rush of relief. She did not feel a cold shiver run down her spine. She simply felt the weight of her own body against the vinyl seat, the steady, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the tires over the expansion joints of the road, and the cold, clean air of the morning rising as they turned toward the station. The rain in Portland, Oregon, did not fall in sharp, heavy drops. It was a soft, great mist that hung in the air, clinging to the needles of the towering Douglas firs outside Eleanor's third-floor studio window. She performed her physical routine. She stood at her small, clean laminate counter, unwrapping a fresh lemon she had bought at the corner market for 99 cents. With her small, sharp paring knife, she cut a single thin wheel. She dropped the yellow slice into a plain white ceramic mug, poured steaming water over a chamomile tea bag, and watched the water turn a pale, clean gold. The studio smelled of cedar, fresh paint, and the faint, sweet trace of lavender soap. It was a quiet space. There were no trophies on the walls. There were no faded Persian carpets carrying the dust of 20 years of neglect. There was only her bed, her small pine desk, and 2 unpacked cardboard boxes resting neatly in the corner. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop. Because she had changed her phone number the morning she arrived in Oregon, her personal device was entirely silent. But her new employer, the Portland Heights Medical Group, had issued her a professional email address for her clinical charting, eleanor.vance@portlandhealth.org. She clicked on her inbox. There were 4 emails from the clinic administrator regarding her upcoming orientation schedule, 1 automated message from her new bank confirming her direct deposit setup, and a single flagged message in her junk folder. The sender was Julian, vance@vancealawchicago.com. The subject line read, "Emergency, contact me immediately." Eleanor clicked the message. She did not rush. She took a slow, quiet sip of her chamomile tea, letting the warm herbal steam rise against her face before she began to read. Julian, 11:14 a.m. Eleanor, I don't know what kind of game you are playing or why you changed your number, but this has gone entirely too far. I had to get this email address from your old clinic manager after lying and telling him it was a family emergency. It is an emergency. Mom and Dad are in complete ruin. Dad's leg became severely infected after they went to the county ER on Sunday. They didn't have the money for the antibiotics, and because you weren't there to manage his care, he's been admitted to the municipal hospital. The doctors are talking about a partial amputation if the tissue doesn't recover. Worse, the bank has served them with a foreclosure warning on the house. Apparently, they used their entire pension reserve and a high-interest cash advance to cover my Sorrento deposits last week. They have $12 in their checking account. They can't pay the mortgage. They can't pay the hospital bills. And they have no car because Mom says your Corolla has vanished from the driveway. They are calling my office 3 times an hour, Eleanor. It is disrupting my caseload. I cannot have my clients hearing my mother weeping on the speakerphone. I am an associate at this firm. My reputation is on the line. I tried to explain to them that I cannot afford to pay their mortgage and their medical bills. But they won't listen to me. They keep saying you will sort it out. You are the one who lived with them. You are the nurse. You need to pack your things, get back to Ohio, and handle this. I will wire you $300 for your gas. But you need to take them off my hands immediately. This is your responsibility. Reply to this email the second you get it. Eleanor sat perfectly still. She was doing her final internal calculation. The cost of Julian's train ticket from Sorrento back to Naples, $18. The cost of Julian's rent on his Michigan Avenue loft, $2,400. The cost of her own freedom, priceless. Julian had spent his entire life taking. He had taken their parents' money, their parents' pride, and ultimately, Eleanor's $8,450 of emergency savings. He had lived like a king on the labor of the sister he chose to ignore. Now the natural resource had run dry. The parents who had funneled every spare dime into his luxury lifestyle were finally his responsibility. They were his bills to pay. They were his phone calls to answer. They were his burden to carry. The golden child was finally going to have to pay the tax on the kingdom he had inherited. Eleanor moved her cursor to the top right corner of the screen. She did not reply. She did not explain. She did not tell him that she was 2,000 miles away, or that her new life had already begun. She clicked the button marked Block Sender. She clicked Confirm. The email disappeared from her screen, leaving her inbox completely clean, white, and silent. She closed her laptop. She picked up her white ceramic mug, walked to the window, and looked out at the gray Portland mist. The rain was quiet, whispering against the glass, carrying her home into the deep, beautiful dark of her own choosing. Some silences are meant to be broken. Others are meant to be kept forever. If you found Eleanor's journey compelling, if you felt the quiet, devastating triumph of a boundary finally drawn against those who took her for granted, we invite you to become a permanent part of our community. Stories like this require patience, depth, and a commitment to psychological truth. By subscribing to our channel and turning on the notification bell, you ensure that you will never miss a single chapter of our long-form cinematic dramas. Tell us in the comments below, would you have walked away, or would you have signed the green paper? Thank you for listening. Your support allows us to keep crafting these deep, quiet worlds. Until next time, keep your boundaries clear and protect your own silence.